5 minutes. So.
Ja, nå begynner vi nå. I think it's about time to start. So, dear judges, professors, colleagues, and friends, welcome to this half-day seminar on accountability for ISIL or Daesh, national or international responsibility. My name is Mats Harlem, and I'm head of the Committee on IHL and Refugee Law at ICJ Norway. Between June 2014 and December 2017, ISIL captured and controlled large parts of Iraq and Syria, committing grave breaches of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Today, according to Wilson Center, almost 4 years after ISIL lost most of the territorial control in Syria and Iraq, thousands of former ISIL fighters and members and families are still being detained without a trial. According to Human Rights Watch report of March 2021, nearly 43,000 foreigners, men, women, and children linked to ISIL remain detained in inhuman and degrading conditions by regional authorities in northeast Syria, often with the explicit or implicit consent of their countries of nationality. Some of these ISIL fighters have been released to local communities. Some have been sentenced. The courts and their verdicts, however, have never been recognized by the Syrian government or international authorities. What has then been done on the international level to hold ISIL accountable? After the fall of ISIL, the UN Security Council voted unanimously in 2017 to ask the UN to establish a unit to assist Iraq in investigating crimes that may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and promote accountability for crimes committed by ISIL. The investigation team to promote accountability for crimes committed by Daesh or ISIL, UNITAD, has worked to collect, preserve, and store evidence in Iraq, and has concluded that members of ISIL have committed war crimes. Much remain, however, to be done when it comes to ensuring accountability for ISIL. Most members of ISIL have been arrested and imprisoned in Iraq, Syria, and the Kurdish region of Iraq. For most part, They are not citizens of the countries in which they have fought. Some have been sentenced according to Iraqi anti-terrorism legislation, and we will hear about this later during this seminar. Attempts to, however, establish an international tribunal in the region have not yet been fruitful. Most European countries oppose the return of ISIL members and their families to their home countries and support accountability through courts in the region. Still, there are some court cases against ISIL members and members of their families in the European countries, including also Norway. Questions that remains include where and how accountability for international crimes best may be ensured. Does it make a difference if ISIL members and their families are held accountable through national anti-terror legislations, or should they be held accountable for international crimes in international courts? To what extent may they be held accountable in their home countries for crimes committed in other states, extraterritorial jurisdictions? What should be also left to national courts, and what accountability should the international community ensure? These are among some of the questions that we hope this conference will address. The conference will be divided into two sessions. Session 1 will include speeches from former judges with a background from ICC and ICTY, former judges Howard Morrison. And we will also hear from Judge Rezgar M that works at the court in the Kurdish region of Iraq. They will share some of the experience on accountability for violation of international law in international and national courts. Session 2 will be on accountability here in Norway. We will also hear from Norwegian prosecutors and lawyers that have dealt with some of these questions here in Norway. And then before I give the floor to our first honorable speaker, Mr. Howard Morrison, I will also like to show you a short statement given by Karim Khan, former special advisor to UNITAD, now the chief prosecutor of the ICC, that he gave in Doha some time ago on the accountability for ISIL. So if you can just...
I would do like this, because we want to get out clever than we entered in this room, more clever. I will ask Dr. Ahmad Khan first one good idea for rehabilitation. Then I would go to Khalid Kozer about one good idea for rehabilitation for Ahmad, for reintegration, and then I will ask a very short conclusion by Ambassador Laborde. So first, Ahmad Khan, just one good idea for good rehabilitation.
Well, before that, I want to dissent from the premise that the focus is on the 3 R's, and you wanted us to be provocative, and I'll say it discloses perhaps a degree of naivety. Punishment is important. We're dealing with an organization that has burnt people alive, that has raped, that is subjected to slavery, that has murdered, and that has crucified individuals. And the idea that in this wonderful setting, with these lovely hopes, and we can have analogies to the 1951 Refugee Convention, and think, oh, okay, this is a population humanitarian problem in which we can return people that have had a well-founded fear of persecution, is simply not opposite. Even after the defeat of Daesh, even after aerial bombardment and kinetic measures, one should pause, in my respectful view, for a moment and look at the hard core of darkness that remains clearly in some people's hearts and minds. Because even then, we have seen recently, or at least some months ago, the black Daesh flag raised in our whole camp. So the idea that this is yesterday's problem and not a current problem today is a recipe for disaster. And I think one of the most important, you can't jump the alphabet R to P, and if you do so, the language and the narrative will not make any sense at all. We need to separate that hardcore that represents not only a national security danger, not only is it a requirement of justice that these individuals that would, if they're given half a chance, would kill, burn, rape, and subject to a virulent un-Islamic ideology, they would do so again, whether it's in Sahel or in Libya or in Europe. We need to actually make sure we do proper investigations. And again, I make no apology to come back to my mandate. It is to feed into evidence to any court countries that are receiving and willing to receive foreign fighters, or countries that happen upon foreign fighters that are on their territory, that we give them that ammunition, that evidence that will allow incriminatory or exculpatory, that will allow the rule of law to prevail. Because unless there are credible investigations, there is a real risk that any process will simply seem as sectarianism, as opposed to something valuable that will help alleviate and ameliorate a problem that is before all of us.
Thank you very much, Khalid Kozer.
Thank you. With this and a few introductory remarks from my side, I would like to ask Howard Morrison, former judge.
How will we survive?
Sorry. With this music, to please take the floor. Thank you.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for inviting me. What you probably don't know is that I have Norwegian genes. In the past, my ancestors went from, it was probably Denmark in those days, I have to confess, to the north of Scotland and then spread out. I took one of those DNA tests. What I found out, to my surprise, is that I'm 1% Kashmiri. Hard to believe. But my great-great-grandfather married an Anglo-Indian lady when he was serving in the British Army. Closer? Right, okay. But it's great to be back in Norway. I didn't know we were going to hear from Karim Khan. I've known Karim for probably 25 years, one way and another. He's a very solid lawyer, a very good advocate, and I think he will motivate the prosecution department at the ICC in a way that's not been done hitherto. So I'm very happy with that. And the first thing I want to say is I think the lack of an international court or tribunal to deal with ISIL is simply a continuing disgrace and an example of a lack of political will to address an extremely serious and, as Karim said, ongoing problem. We tend to put things that have kind of disappeared off the front page into the rubbish bin of history and pretend that they're not a problem anymore. I'm afraid there couldn't be more wrong. This is an ongoing problem, and it's going to get worse again before it gets better. But what of the ICC? I was a judge at ICTY. I tried Radovan Karadzic. Those of you who don't know the Balkan situation perhaps don't recognize how savage a conflict it was. And at its base, it was a religious war as much as a political one, with the tripartite religious divisions, the Roman Catholic Croats, the Serbian Orthodox, and the Bosnian Muslims. And the Bosnian Muslims had always been vilified, and for many years, and known as the Turks because of their coming into that territory during the days of the Ottoman Empire. And then at the ICC, I was dealing mainly with cases of Africa. I wasn't a trial judge at the ICC, I just did appeals. But that has a huge advantage because you get a very good oversight of the whole of the cases. But I think there's a misconception about the ICC. and how it can deal with people like ISIL, and indeed any cases, because a lot of people view the ICC simply as a new court, a replacement, if you like, to deal worldwide with those issues that the ICTY and the ICTR were dealing with, and I was a defence counsel at both of those courts. I think we should view the ICC not simply as a new court, but part of a new legal system, which consists of the ICC and the Rome Statute and the Assembly of States Parties, intertwined with the national jurisdiction of each party state. And within that cooperative system, states have the primary obligation to investigate and prosecute Rome Statute crimes, which would include the sort of crimes committed by ISIL. The importance of the national implementation of the Rome Statute into national jurisdictions cannot be overstated. I think it's absolutely critical that where it hasn't been done, it needs to be done, and it sits ill with the world that states who refuse to investigate or prosecute crimes within their own territories nevertheless criticize those states who do, and in particular criticize the ICC for having done so. Even more so when it comes to those powerful states who are not members of the Assembly of States Parties, which includes, of course, the United States, Russia, China, India, Israel, and many other notable and important states. And so that's part of the problem, and part of the solution is for those states, if they won't join the Assembly of States Parties, if they won't join the family of the ICC, at the very least, they should be making extra efforts to make sure that they are prosecuting Rome Statute crimes, either within their own territories or assisting in the prosecution of those crimes elsewhere, even if it's only by financial contribution, which some of them can well afford to do so. The single most important step is to adopt into national jurisdictions the Rome Statute, or a statute very closely aligned to it. It's important for removing impunity and also for recognizing at both the national and international level the obligation upon mature states to deal with these matters. I believe that the object of international law is to act as a movement to thrust national states into action where their domesticity causes inaction. But not so much is known about it. I gave a talk to a group of British judges maybe 5 years ago at a judicial training course in the UK, and I asked how many of them knew that on the British statute book there was what was called the International Criminal Court Act. Out of an audience of about 50, 3 hands went up. So even amongst the judges in the UK, there wasn't the understanding and recognition that we have imported into the UK legislation Rome Statute crimes and have an obligation to prosecute them where and when we can. There's a side to ISIL which of course is problematic. The ICC suffered greatly, or suffers greatly, from the fact it relies entirely upon mature state cooperation. It has no police force. The ad hoc tribunals, against whom the ICC is sometimes unfairly criticised, had an enormous advantage of having UN Chapter 7 powers. They could require, and as a judge in the Karadzic case, we did require, states to cooperate with the court, and they did, without exception. Now, if the ICC had been a child of the United Nations, politically much more difficult than even the Rome Statute road, it would have had Chapter 7 powers. This enormously difficult issue of cooperation wouldn't be there, and it would be much easier for the court to operate, and in particular to extradite people to the jurisdiction of the court in The Hague, which is again an ongoing and continuing problem. And without active cooperation and without a police force, it is never going to be an easy task. There are two jobs at the ICC I would not want. One is Karim Khan's, the prosecutor, and I wouldn't want to be the registrar either, because he has to deal with the finances. That brings me on to something else about the ICC. Big building, but a small court. The ICC has but 3 courtrooms. It only has 13 judges dealing with all of the pre-trial and trial matters. 5 of us were permanently in appeals. What that means in practical terms is that there is a very great limit on the number of cases that can be brought to the court, and as a corollary of that, the types of cases that can be brought to the court. It can only take the most egregious cases, and it's designed only to deal with the most senior of offenders. And a lot of, for instance, ISIL fighters in the field are on the battlefield. They're soldiers. They may be officers or they may be commanders if there's no officer structure, but they're not at the top of the command and responsibility tree. And I think there is going to be a reluctance in courts in Iraq, for instance, to grapple with the difficulties of command and superior responsibility and the extra layers that that puts onto a prosecution. So I think that's something that's got to be recognised and addressed. The ICC and ISIL operatives are working in rather different spheres. If you could get the ideological or military commanders of ISIL to The Hague, that would be a different matter. But again, you're running into enormous difficulties in terms of capture and extradition. You've got to understand how the OTP works, the Office of the Prosecutor in The Hague. People think of it almost as if it was like your national or anybody's national prosecution system. It isn't. It doesn't have a national police force, doesn't have a national prosecuting authority behind it. It's a standalone entity like the ICC itself. And there are 3 basic components of the Office of the Prosecutor: jurisdiction, complementarity and cooperation, who deal with preliminary examinations, providing advice on issues of jurisdiction, which can be ferociously complex, admissibility and cooperation, coordination of judicial cooperation with national courts, and external relations. There is then, secondly, the investigation division, which is in charge of providing investigative support and coordinating the field deployment of staff, which can be a terribly difficult job. Imagine going out to the Central African Republic to investigate allegations of war crimes in the bush there, in a culture which is very different from your own, and in languages which you require constant interpretation and translation, even for the most basic of conversations. And then they provide a crime analysis, an analysis of information and evidence which is gathered. So there's an enormous analytical component to the ICC. It gets an awful amount of information, but how much of that can be actively used has got to be carefully sifted and balanced to make sure it's relevant and admissible. Assuming you get that far, the prosecution division then prepares the litigation strategies and actually conducts the prosecution in cases, including through written and oral submissions to the judges. Early on I mentioned complementarity. The ICC gives primacy, as you know, to national jurisdictions. It does not take away any of their sovereignty. It is not interested in replacing them. What it is interested in is that national jurisdictions take the responsibility, the mature responsibility, for investigating and prosecuting their own nationals or offences which happen on their territory. Now, if everybody did that responsibly and properly, and with a view to fair trial rights and the rule of law, then the ICC would probably not need to exist. But it doesn't. People don't do that, and it does need to exist. And if it needs to exist, then it's got to be cooperated with at every level. As you know, the UN Security Council, one of the ways a case can come to the ICC is by a referral from the UN Security Council. It's happened twice with the ICC in the cases of Darfur and Libya. Interestingly, Of course, in the permanent members of the Security Council are Russia, China, the United States, France, and the UK. Of those 5, only 2, the UK and France, are members of the court. But what it means is that those other 3 who sometimes decry the court, one country in particular, have in fact both de jure and de facto recognized the court and the jurisdiction of the court. So when I hear some American politicians turn around and call it a kangaroo court and a corrupt court, the irony bites home. Frankly, being called corrupt by 1 or 2 of those people is ironic in itself. But I won't say more than that. So where do we go forward? Well, we know how cases get to the ICC. There are basically 3 main methods under Article 13 of the Rome Statute. Any state party to the Rome Statute can report and request the prosecutor to carry out an investigation, and that has happened. As I said, the United Nations Security Council may refer a situation to the court. The prosecutor may also open an investigation on his own initiative. I say his now because the gender has changed, but only after the authorization by judges. I was one of the judges in the appeals court that authorized the investigation into Afghanistan. Whoa. Talk about jabbing a hornet's nest with a stick. We all saw what the result of that was. But it's had to be done. How effective that's going to be now, since the coalition forces have left Afghanistan, and bearing in mind that Karim Khan has now said that the only realistic route forward for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity in Afghanistan will be against the Taliban, and how you're going to get cooperation for that is another matter. But you can see what the scale and complexity of the problems that the ICC does face when you see the challenges of those natures that it has to face. Exceptionally, Cates can accept jurisdiction on an ad hoc basis by submitting a declaration under Article 12.3 of the Rome Statute. Now that is almost a footnote to the jurisdiction of the ICC, but I personally think it's of enormous consequence and can be of enormous consequence. If states who are not parties to the ICC, like, for instance, Iraq, would accept the jurisdiction of the ICC by submitting a declaration under Article 12, then that opens doors which would otherwise not be opened. What does that require? Enormous political will on the part of the states concerned, and that means governments stepping out sometimes on a limb, because the jurisdiction of the ICC is a political hot potato in many countries, and certainly in countries which are not already members of the Assembly of States Parties. But I think the way forward for ISIL, to prosecute ISIL, would be in that direction. But above all, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, I think it's a substantial disgrace and a stain on the political will and determination of the international community that an international court or tribunal to do this, to ensure fair trial rights under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, because there's no point in having a trial unless it's unequivocally as fair a trial as the circumstances can engender. That's the most important thing, and that's what the judges, any judges in any court, national or international, have to bear in mind. I hope that will change. If it doesn't go through the Security Council of the United Nations, it stands a better chance, because then you avoid the power of veto. The other thing that I will only touch upon, as I'm rapidly running out of time, is universal jurisdiction, which we all know about. That is an enormous way forward. Again, it requires a great deal of political will on the part of the state that's undertaking to exercise universal jurisdiction. But if every mature state with a working, proper, functioning and fair judicial and court system were to undertake universal jurisdiction in the way that the Spanish have done in the past, and the Germans and the Swedes and the Dutch and other nations have done, then that would be a way forward. But with populist governments, that's a hard road. They see it as an attack on sovereignty. And the amazing thing is that populist governments the world over do not seem to understand what sovereignty really means, and they have very curious concepts of it. But those of you who may be slightly worried about the rise of populism, don't worry too much. I think it's a sine wave curve phenomena. It goes generation by generation. You have internationalism, multinationalism, multiculturalism rising to the fore, then drops away into nationalism, populism, and self-interest, and then eventually rises again. International, if you look back through history, that's what's happened. It's a slow process, I fear. But that's what's happened. If somebody tried to set up the ICC today, wouldn't happen. It was set up at the right time when internationalism and multinationalism and multiculturalism was in the forefront of political and philosophical thinking. It's not at the moment, and we can all see places where it's sadly lacking and where the independence of judges is under huge threat in countries where 20 years ago you would not have contemplated it or expected it. But let's go forward with universal jurisdiction. I've got a bugbear at the moment. I want to add environmental crimes into the matrix of crimes that the ICC can deal with. You've heard of ecocide. I think it's important. Actually, I think there's another route. I think we can construct crimes against humanity out of serious environmental crimes, and the category of crimes against humanity is not closed. So a cunning and ambitious prosecutor, I think, could do it. And Karim is I won't say he's cunning, he's a clever prosecutor. I think he could do it. And you avoid a lot of difficulties with amending the Rome Statute to include ecocide, because amending the Rome Statute is like changing the Texas gun laws. I mean, you know, it's a hard uphill struggle. You're much easier off just dealing with things as you have them already under the jurisdiction of the court. Lastly, I just wanted to say that I'm really pleased to see Judge Rezgar M talking to us today. I went to Iraq in 2005 for what I thought was 3 months and stayed for a year. And I got to know Judge Rezgar well. He was one of the judges that I was trying to explain the nuances of international law to, and he really took it on board. He is for my money, and I don't want to blow too much sunshine at him to embarrass him, but he is really an outstanding judge, and we're very lucky to have him with us today. So thank you very much indeed.
Han hører meg, ikke sant? Hva skal jeg gjøre med henne? صوتك وبكروا
لكو صوتكم
استاجيوم ليتا
سجل لي ما
اما ديني
من ايوا والله ابينم ادبينم
ايواش قصبكو وردو باسانيو ترجماك
مساسري منه بوقسه كردن
همي
باشا طلعتان لي بيروش باش بانو خان لتو لا هاوردی هاوڕێم هیوادارم باش بێت و لە ئوستاد کەریم خان و لە هەموو ئەوانەی کە لەوێن کە باشداری ئەو نەدوێن بەداخەوە کە نەمتوانی بەهۆی نەخۆشیەوە ئامادە بم لەوێ کە تام و چێژی تەواوی لێ ببینم لە مؤتەمەرەکە و ئەمە هەر بۆ پێکەنین ئەمەوێ بڵێم ئەم جۆرە گوێگرتن و حیوارە وەکو ئەو وایە ماچ لە پشتی پەنجەرەوە بکەیت یا لە پشتی شوشەوە ئەوەندە لە تامی لێ بینین لە کۆنفرانسەکە.
بەسەرچاو. Hello everyone, and thank you for having me today. I want to send my greetings to everyone who is participating today. Thank you for having me, and a warm greeting to my friend Howard Morrison. I'm very grateful to participate today in this event, and I'm very sorry for not being able to attend physically due to illness. And I just want to say, for the sake of a humoristic joke, that attending in this way is like kissing your loved ones through a window. That's the best taste we can get from it. Pekanin, vale.
من هەندێ لەسەر تەجروبەی خۆمان لە مەحاکمی کوردستان و بەشێکیش لە عێراق ساکەم و ئیحسایەکیشتان پێڵێم ژمارەیەکتان پێڵێم کە ئەو داوانەی ئێمای بینین پێم وایە عێراق زۆربەی کەیسەکانی داعش لە عێراقە و لە عێراق بە هەموویەوە لە کوردستانیش و لە خوارەوە بەڵام ژمارەی کەیسەکانی کوردستان بێگومان کەمترە باشە ئەوە نێبرێت.
I will talk about my experience as a judge in both the Kurdistan court and the Iraqi court. Most of the cases about the ISIL members are being dealt with in the Iraqi courts, but that also includes the Kurdistani part. Balak Agrisgar.
عێراق و لە کوردستان قانونێکی تایبەتمان هەیە بۆ ئێرهاب لە عێراق قانونی ژمارە 13 ساڵی 2005 لە کوردستانیش قانونی ژمارە 3 2006 ئەم دوو قانونە زۆر لە یەکەچن وەکو ئەوە وایە نسخەی یەک بن کە کوردستان دواتر دەری کردووە بەو قانونە کێشەکانی ئێرهاب یەکلاکەینەوە بەو دوو قانونە ئێمە لە کوردستان بە قانونی 2006 ئەوانیش لەوێ بە قانونی 2005
We have a national law in Iraq.
قانونی بەرەنگاربوونەوەی تێرۆر.
We have a national law in Iraq and in Kurdistan about terrorism acts. The first one is from Kurdistan, it's number 13 from 2005. And from Kurdistan is 2006, number 3. These two laws are identical, and it's similar to the terrorlovgivningen, which we have in the Penal Code of Norway.
تحقیقات یا لێکۆڵینەوەش هەر لە محاکمەکانی ئاسایی کوردستان و عێراق یەکلاکرێتەوە لێکۆڵینەوە لە قۆناغی لێکۆڵینەوە پێشەوەی بینێرن بۆ دادگا.
The investigation is done by the Iraqi forces before they come to the Iraqi court.
بە هەمان شێوازی کلاسیک لە لێکۆڵینەوە
چۆن؟
کە بە هەمان شێوازی کلاسیکی لێکۆڵینەوە هیچ وەسیلەیەک و ئامرازی پێشکەوتووی عەسری لە بەردەم دادگاکانی لێکۆڵینەوەی ئێمەدا نییە.
The investigation is done in the similar way as for any other punitive acts. Is not an investigation adapted for the ISIL members in accordance with the Rome Statute.
ئەم کەسانەی کە بە تاوانی تیرۆر ئەگیرێن لای ئێمە کەمیان ئەوانن کە لە کاتی شەڕا بگیرێن، بەڵکو زۆربەیان لە ناو شارەکانە ئەگیرێن، بە تایبەتی ئەوانەی کوردستان دوای ئەوەی کە داعش مووسڵ و ناوچەکانی تری وەسەطی یعنی کەرکووک و تکریت و ئەو ناوچانەی جێڵایەوە کۆمەڵێکی زۆریان هاتن بۆ کەمپەکان ئەو کەمپی ئاوارەکان لەوێ لە ڕێگەی مخبری سڕی یعنی ئەوەی کە لە شاهێتی نهێنی و لە ڕێگەی هەندێ سەرچاوەوە کە هی ئاسایشەکان و ئەمنوانەیە ئەمانە ئەگیران.
باش. Most of the ISIL members who are being arrested has not been arrested during the war period. They have been arrested after ISIL left, such as in Mosul, Kirkuk, Tikrit, which are the outskirts of the Kurdish area. And they are being arrested in the camps because many of them has fled to the camps. And there are others who are being reported among others. So they are not really being arrested due to the acts of war, but being arrested afterwards through others and in the camps.
هەواڵدەری نهێنی بەشێکی بە لە ڕێگەی هەواڵدەری نهێنیەوە ئەگیران. هەواڵدەری نهێنی یعنی بە ئەوەی کە بەدزیەوە یەک بە پۆلیس و بە ئاسایش ئەڵێ فڵان کەس داعشە بەس ناوی خۆی نابات نابێتە شاهید نابێتە شاهد لە ناو کێشەکە هەروە ناوی بە مەجهول ئەمێنێتەوە بە ناڕوونی ئەمێنێتەوە بەس ناوەکەی لە وەرەقەیەکە حفظەکرێت لە مەلەف بەڵام ئەو کەسەی کە ئەگیرێت لەسەر قسەی ئەم نازانێ ئەوە کێ هەواڵی پێدا دژی داوە. ئەمە وەسیلەیەکە بۆ ئەوەی کە بەکاری هێنن بۆ ئەوەی کە داعشی پێ بدۆزنەوە. وەسیلەیەکی تریش هەیە کە وەسیلەی لێدان و تعذیبە.
Let's see. Many are also being arrested due to anonymous reports coming in to the police, and they are suspecting the persons to be ISIL members. So the ones who are being arrested and accused of being ISIL members will never get the opportunity to know who has reported them. This is one technique, and the other technique is through torture.
من لە دادگای تەمیز ئیشوکاری منداڵانە بینم. سەرۆکی دەستەی لە دادگای تەمیز سەرۆکی دەستەیەکم کە ئیشی منداڵانە بینێت. لە ساڵی 2019 192 کەیسی ئێرهابمان یەکلا کردوێتەوە. لە ساڵی 2020 72 کەیسمان یەکلا کردوێتەوە. لە ساڵی 2021 تاوەکو مانگی 11 تا دەوری دەی مانگی 11 تا ئێستا 7 کەیسمان بۆ هاتووە. ڕەنگە تاوەکو ئەم مانگی داهاتوش چەند کەیسێکی تریش هەر بێت. ئەمانە بە زۆری خەڵکی مووسڵن ئەم منداڵانە بە زۆری خەڵکی مووسڵن یا خەڵکی ئەترافی تکریتن یا حەویجە ئەو ناوچانە کە دوایی ڕایان کردووە هاتوونەتە ناوچەی دهۆک هاتوونەتە مجەمەعەکان ئەوانەی کەمپەکان بە زۆری لە دهۆک و لە هەولێر لە نزیکی خازر و ئەوانەش کەمپی لێیە لە ڕێگەی دوایەوەی کە ناویانە بن بەشێکیشیان ئەمانە کە ئەگیرێن داعش نین لە واقعدا بەڵکو لە نەتیجەی شتی شەخصی و شەڕ و کێشەی بینی خۆیان یەکێک دێ شکاتیان لێکا و لە ماوەیەکی زۆر ئەمێننەوە لە ئاسایش و دواتر محاکەمە ئەکرێن بەشێکیان ئازاد دەبن و بەشێکیشان حکمە بن لە نەتیجەی وشەی ئەو ئیفادەی شایەتی شاراوە یان لە ئەنجامی لێدان. بەڵام ئێمە لە محکمەی ئەوانە تەرجەمە کە دوای ئێمەش ڕێی خۆم لەسەر محکمەی تەمیز ئێمە چۆن قەرار بێت.
I work in the appeal court in the capital of Kurdistan Iraq, in Erbil, and the cases which I am occupied with regards children. In 2019, we worked with 192 cases regarding children accused of being ISIL members. In 2020, it was 72 cases, and in 2021, until November, it's been 70 cases. And so there is probably going to be more.
تقريبا لنزيكي شفط كيس أواني إرهاب بوا. يعني تقريبا نبيت تقسيم شيء مو كيس كان أوان
لا سياسي
مثلا
لا سياسي
يعني يتقسيم شيء أو هنا أو كيساني همو كيس كان يجلس شيء بوتا إرهاب أوانا.
One-third
حالتها مزيج نيوي يستفيش الضلام هي جوركانيش.
باش بترجمة. 1/3 of the cases has led to decisions of the children being actual members of ISIL. But many of the cases they're not really ISIL members, but there has been a personal conflict between maybe the families or the children, and therefore they are accused of being ISIL members. Most of these children are children who has fled from the Mosul, Tikrit areas in the outskirts of Kurdistan, and they have fled to the camps of Duhok and Erbil, which is in Kurdistan. So it's mostly 2/3 of the cases are because of personal conflicts, and this leads to the children being in prison for a very long time without the rule of law really being applied to them before they come to the court. Bale.
لدرباري أو حكماني ك إما دريكين لسر من دالكان بشيكي أجر بزانين بلغانية يا بلغكان لاوازا چونکە ئەمە بەهۆی ظروفێکی سیاسیەوە ئەو منداڵانە تووشی بەعزی حاڵەت بوون بردوونیان لە مزگەوتەکانە قورئانیان پێ خوێندوون یا تەدریبیان پێکردوون ئەمانە 3 ساڵ نزیکی 3 ساڵ داعش لە مووسڵ بوو حکوومەت بوو لە مووسڵ بۆیە ئێمە من لە محکەمەی تەمیز زۆر مراعاتی ئەو بارودۆخە ئەکەم چونکە ئەوانە بەشێکیان لەبەر نەبوونی ئیشیان کردووە لە دوکانێکە یا لە لای داعش بکرەیەکی مانگانەی کەمیان وەرگرتووە مەسەلەن لە مەطعەمیان بووە چایچیان بووە یا لە ئیشێکی تریان پێ سپاردووە ئەوانە وە بە زۆریش لە هەندێک جار لە مزگەوتەکانە فێری قورئان و فێری ئەویان کردوون کە چۆن ئیمان بێنێت بە ئەبوو بەکر بەغدادی و بە ئەوە گەورەکانی ئەوان ئەمانە زۆری لە ڕێگەی هەندێک جار ترس و ترساندن بووە کەمی هەیە یا هەندێک جار لە مناڵەکان باوکیان بۆتە داعش لە ڕێگەی باوکیانەوە یا لە ڕێگەی برای
باش ڕێگام بە according well let's see it's not easy to translate simultaneously. I'll do my best. Regarding the cases which we have had, we have to look at the evidence. How clear are the evidence? If there is a doubt about whether the evidences are clear, then we do not accuse these children of being terrorists or ISIL members. And we have to remember that these children has been growing up in a very political tensed period of time, and they have lived in Mosul, among others, where ISIL has been in power for the last 5 years. Many of those children has been radicalized through the mosques. They have been taught to worship Abu Bakr Baghdadi and his companions. They have been working for the ISIL members and received a minimum salary, or their fathers or brothers have become a part of the ISIL members. So through this, they have been indoctrinated into the ISIL mentalization, and that's some of the circumstances we have to look at when we have a case regarding them. بله.
ئێمە زۆر جار طبعاً لەبەرەوەی کێشەکان لە کوردستان نەبووە لە مووسڵ بووە لە ئەطرافی مووسڵ بووە لە قەزا و ناحیەکان بووە لە دەور و پشتی سنجار بووە لە دەور و پشتی تکرید بووە زۆر زەحمەتە دەلیل کۆ بکرێتەوە بەڵگەکان کۆ بکرێتەوە بۆیە هەروەها لە ڕووی قانونیشەوە ئێمە تووشی کێشەیەکی تریش بووین کە قانونی ئێمە بۆ ئەو ناوچانەیە کە کوردستانە بەڵام ئەو خەڵکانە لە دەرەوەی کوردستان پەیوەندی داعشیان بووە ئێمە هەر کەیە لە ناو کوردستانەوە لە کامپەکانان ئەیانگرن ئێمە ئەکرێ بڵێم زۆر جار ئیشەکەی ئێمە لە ڕووی شوێنەوە ئەوە جەریمەکە لە شوێنێکی تر بۆ نەبووە ئێمە بیکەنە بۆە بینێرینەوە بۆ مووسڵ بۆ ئەطرافانەی تر بەڵام ئێمە هەر ئیشەکانە بینین تازە هاتوونە تا کوردستان ئێمە لە ڕووی حکومەکانەوە چکە قانونێکمان هەیە بۆ منداڵان جگە لە قانونی تیرۆر قانونێکی تایبەتیمان هەیە کە هین تایبەتە بە منداڵ ئەوە لەوێ سزایەکانی زۆر کەمە باشە یعنی لەگەڵ عقلێتی منداڵە گونجاوە ئێمە ئەو حکومانەی کە ئەیاندەین لە بینی 6 مانگ سجن هەتاوەکو ساڵێک تا 9 مانگ هەتا جاریوا هەیە ئەگەر زۆر بێت ئەڕوا بۆ 2 ساڵ من بۆ خۆم لەگەڵ ئەوەم کە ئەو سزایانە تدبیرە بۆ منداڵ ئەبێ چاکی بکەیت ئیسلاحی بکەیت فکری بگۆڕیت نەک بە سجن چارەسەر ناکرێت دەبێت نەسیحەتیان بکەیت مێشتیان ئەوان بەعزێکیان مێشتیان ینی فکریان تێکداون دەبێ فکریان ڕێکخەیتەوە.
Many times, because the act that has been done is outside of the Kurdish areas, according to the law, we do not have the jurisdiction to use the Kurdish law on acts done outside of the Kurdish areas, such as in Mosul, Sinjar, Tikrit, and not only the jurisdiction, but also the difficulty of collecting evidence, sufficient evidence in the case. So that's one issue we have, but nonetheless, we do apply the Kurdish law also for these acts done outside the Kurdistan area. Although they get arrested when they come inside the Kurdish area. And we also have own law which is for the children. So if a child does something that is punitive, we do adapt the imprisonment to that. For example, in Kurdistan, yes, when a child is 11 years old, 10 years old, yeah, that.
11 لكردستان 11 لعراق 9.
In Iraq, a child can be imprisoned for punitive acts from the age of 9. In Kurdistan, it's from the age of 11. So the imprisonment can be between, if the evidence are strong, the imprisonment can be between 6 months and 1 year. And at the most gravest acts, it can be up till 2 years. But in my opinion, imprisoning these children are not the best solution, because they are being radicalized, and we have to focus on changing their mentality. Vale.
إما بالنسبة لجوركان ولا كردستان كار يعني ل 2020 لمجموعي 1190 دعوة هي همو قضية جوركان كان 121 تيرور بوا لسال 2020.
أتواني دوباريكيتو.
لمجموعي 1190 دعوة كيشا ل 2020 521 تيرور بوا هي جوركان.
Okay. When it comes to أما هي منال بويا هي داعش
بعد. أنا كباسم كرت يشتري ومنال بس إسات مصر جورة.
So now for the grown-up ISIL members, We've had 1,900 cases in 2020, where we have decided upon in court 521 of those 1,900 cases have been ISIL members.
يعني نزيكي نيوي همو كيسكان أوان تيرور بوا أمش همو البوي أو عتون أوانن كلا كم بكانان ولا أطراف كاني تروي أينا لكردستان خوي تيرور كما خلقي كردستان تيروري كم تيا رنجا لا كوي أو همو خلقي كباسم كرلا جوركانيش ممكن بيس كسي كردو خلقي ناوتشي هلا بجو سليمانية هوليري تيانا بيت.
And we have to remember, as I told earlier, that most of these 1,900 cases in 2020 are through arrestation of suspected ISIL members in the camps through anonymous reports and from the police investigation part. But in Kurdistan in general, the security is high. It's not much ISIL insecurity. Such as in the rest of Kurdistan. In these 1,900 cases, there's been about 20 to 30 accused ISIL members who has been from the Halabja area or in the Slemani region.
يا هولير جا أوانيش دورة كان شيء للرجاء إنترنت وبيونديا كان دعاية كان بو إرهاب يا بو كان أيناش كيوانية هر بس وكو بنو رخصني كي زياتر للرجاء إنترنت وعندش أكن بو بوانا حكم يعني على إيوه هاوكاري تدورة كان لصالي أمثالة لهزار وشصت دعوة حتى دوينة حتى دوينة بانزي عنزا 410 كشيء تيرور معناه هي جورة كان لدادجاي تميز.
And in 2021, it's been 1,600 cases where there's been a court decision in 410 of those cases. So what are the acts that they're being accused of? Mostly the ISIL members are being accused on internet to promote participation in terror acts.
هندێک لەوانەی کە ئەچوونە دەرەوە بەشێکیان ئەچوونە سووریا لێرەوە لە کوردستانەوە باوکیان کە سوکاریان ئەچوون لە سووریا لە تورکیاوەیان هێنانەوە هەوڵیان بیان هێنەوە بۆ سلێمانی بۆ هەڵەبجەوە.
And other cases are ISIL members in the camps who are going back to Syria to bring their families through the Turkey border back to the Kurdistan region of Iraq.
يعني كسكريان أشون بدوان ده يعني هنا.
لكوه.
لا كرنا كده أشون بسوريا التحاق أنا كده أشون أنا وداعش. كسكريان باوكيان يا بران يا خزميان أشون بسوريا لو باريان ده يعني هنا ولا تركيا يعني هنا يعني برجي تركيا يعني هنا ويا برجي سوريا لا بيني يعني شون رجب بدون جاية أشون محاولة أنا كسكريان كدواي أن زاني شون تناو داعش لدروي عراق أشون كسكريان يعني هنا وأوش هي.
There are also many Syrian refugees in the Kurdistan region which have heard that their children or their brothers are ISIL members and still in Syria. So they would go back to Syria and pay for the ISIL member, the child, so that they can be taken through Turkey back to
يعني
Kurdistan
جوركان
Iraq.
أصل بس 400 كسمان تايسة تادوينه همانا لقضية جوركان لا دادجاي تميز.
ماله.
كيرور.
إيه.
أو جمارة زاني 400 لكن.
So I just want to stress that in 2021, among 1,600 accusation of ISIL membership, we have only decided upon 410 of those cases.
أوجا لا إما لنزيك سليماني سجنية كياه سرب حكومة العراق هي على سوسة. أم سجنا تيروري جنوبي بوديت هي عراقي بوديت هي ناوراستي بوديت ئەمە ئەم سجنە هی کوردستان لە سجنی خۆیانە ئێمە سجنی کوردستان لەوێ ئەوانەی کە حکومە بن بە تیرۆر لەو سجنانن کە لە کوردستانە خۆیان هەن بەڵام ئەوەی سووسە کە لە نزیک سلێمانیە ئەوە نیو سەعاتێک سێ چارێکێک لە سلێمانی دوورە لە بینی دوکان و سلێمانیە ئەو سجنە تیرۆری بۆ دێ لە خواروی عێراقەوە ئەو تیرۆرانەی کە مەحاکمی خواروی عێراق و بەغدا و وەسەڵ و ئەوانە حکمیان لەسەر دەرەکەن ئەوانە زۆریان لەوێ بوون بەڵام ئەم ساڵ ئێستا 132 کەس لەو تیرۆرانە لەوێن
132 کەس
کە لە محکەمەکانی خوارەوە حکمیان داون 132 کەس پار لە مانگی 12 800 کەسیان حکومەتی عێراق بڕیارێک سەرۆکوەزیران بردینەوە بۆ خوارەوە بۆ جنوب بۆ کەرخ بۆ بەغدا ئەطرافی بەغدا بۆ سجنەکانی کە خۆیان هەیەە بەڵام ئێستا 132 کەسمان لەو سجنی سووسە هەیە لە چەند ماڵ سجن هەبوو داخرا
باش The ISIL members who are being taken into the Kurdish courts, they are being also imprisoned in the normal prisons together with the other persons, but those ISIL members who are being treated in the Iraqi courts, they are being sent to this one prison we have in Slemani, which is called Susa, and there are 132 terror ISIL members in this prison today. In November, last year, December, there were 800 of those ISIL members who were being sent back to the Iraqi parts where the court made a case on them and confirmed that they were ISIL members. But right now, it's 132.
نزیکی 500 کەسیان بردەوە بەرەو فالبردنیان بۆ سجنی ناسریە
دووبارەی کەرەوە کاک ڕزگار
پار بوو یا پێرار بوو دو ساڵ پێش ئێستا یا ساڵێک ساڵنێ پێش ئێستا نزیکی 500 لەو محکومە ئەوانەی کە حکم درابوون بە لە سێدارەدار بە ئەعدام
کاک ڕزگار جوان بیکەرە گوێم لەو نییە
ئەو لە دو ساڵ پێش ئێستا نزیکی 500 کەس لاوانەی کە سزای لە سێدارەدانیان هەبوو لە سجنی سووسەوە بردنیان بۆ سجنی ناسریە سجنی حود لە ناسریە
2 years ago, 500 of the ISIL members who were sent to Susa prison were moved back to the Homs prison in Iraq. And this was due to a political disagreement between the Kurdish and the Iraqi regions. So 500 convicted ISIL members were
يعني تقريبا نزيكي 400 كس زي السيداردانيان هبو بردنيانو بو سجني ناصريه تنازانم لوي جيب جيكرا للسريان
were moved back
سجني حود
to the Homs prison which is in Iraq. So when they have a political disagreement, they tend to threat with the ISIL members, the convicted ones in their prisons, by moving them back to the Iraqi part of Homs.
أو سجني سوسا هر نزيكي 1500 كاز لاجريك عمو سجنك.
Okay, and the prison of Susa in Slemani have 170 rooms, prisons, which of 132 are currently used. While there are other times where the prison is holding up to 200 ISIL members. کاک ڕزگار دەتوانی تۆزە باسی دادگا بکەیت و چ جۆرە دادگا باشترە؟
دادگا ئێمە من پێ دەڵێم ئێمە ئیجراعاتەکان هەر بە پێی قانونی عێراقی لێکۆڵینەوە کرێ، بەڵام لێکۆڵینەوەکان عەدالەتی تیان نییە، چونکە لێدان هەیە و زۆر لەوانە عەرەبن تەرجەمەیان بۆ ناکەن، یعنی متەرجمیان نییە. دوایی لە قەزای ئێرهابە بەڕاستی مافی دیفاع یا پارێزەر هیچ ئازادیەکیان نییە. لەوانەیە بازێک چەند مەحامیەکی دیاریکراو بۆیان هەیە بچن بۆ ئاسایشەکان قەزیەکانیان ببینن کە لە ئاسایشن ئەگیرێن و بۆشیان نییە بە ڕاستە خۆ بچنە لای متتەهەمەکان بیان بینن. بۆیە مافی دیفاعیان نییە ئەوان لە سجنەکانە لە لێکۆڵینەوەیە و زۆر قەزیەکانیشان لەلایەنی ترێشەوە زۆر دوعاکەوێت و ئەو دواکەوتنە جاری وا هەیە هیچ تەبری هیچ ینی هۆکارێکیش نییە بۆ دواکەوتنەکە، بەڵام ئەمێنەوە جاری واشەیە کە حکمیش دەرەچێ بەسەریانە هەرایان هێڵمەوە بەریان نادەن بڵێن کە مودەکە تەواوەکەن، مدەی حکومەکەش تەواوەکەن هەر بەرەڵایان ناکەن. مشکلەیەکی تریش هەیە ئەجە دوای ئەچمە سەرەوەی ئەوەی بە کەفیل بەرە بێت یا بەرنابێ ئەوەش بابەتی
ئەتوانین دوای بینەوە سەری چونکە دوایەوە کاتەکەمان تەواو بێ کار ڕزگار. So the final thing I want to say, because I think I've spent a lot of time now on explaining myself, it is that the rule of law is under threat when it comes to the ISIL members. Many of them are tortured. There is no equality. Mostly are Arabic speaking, and they are not there is no translator used under the investigations. Although they have the rights of lawyer, they don't really get a lawyer. There are very few lawyers who are being allowed to go to the police in order to meet them in the prisons. There are very much delayment before their court meeting is held without reason. And most of the time, although they get imprisonment for a certain amount of years, after that period, they are still being held in prison.
غەڵەتێکیش لە محکەمە قانونەکە ئەڵەیە کەس بە کەفیل بەرنابێ هەتا کێشەکەی تەواو دەبێت. بەڵام محکەمە بە تایبەتی محکەمەی تەمیزیش ئەو دەقەیان ئەو نەسڵیان خراپ لێک داوەتەوە، ئەڵێ هەتا ئەگەر زۆر جار بە کەفیل بەرنابێ قەیناوە لە قۆناغی لێکۆڵینەوەیە، بەڵام ئەمە زۆر جار خەڵک ئیفراج دەبێت لە محکەمە، یعنی نەک بە کەفیل ئیفراج دەبێت، قەزەکەی لە محکەمە تەواو دەبێت، ئەڵێ هەتاوەکو نەچێتە دادگای تەمیز لەوێ تەصدیق نەکرێت بەرەڵای ناکەیت. ئەوەشی چێکە لەو مشکلانە کە لە کاتێکا قانونەکەەوە ناڵێ، بەڵام حاکمەکان غەڵەت لێکی دەدەنەوە.
کەفیل چییە؟
کەفیل یعنی بە دەستەبەر، یعنی ئەڵێ من بە وەقتی کێشەکەت دا ناخەم بڕۆ کەفیلێ کەسێک بێنە کە تۆ ئامادەت دەکات لە وەختێک کە محکەمە تۆی ویست. من دێم ئەڵێم بانوو هەر وەختێک محکەمە پێویستی بوو من دێنم من ئامادەیەکەم منە بمە کەفیل بۆ تۆ ئەوە. بەڵام لە قانونی تیرۆرە ئەڵێ خەڵک نابێ بە کەفیل بەربێ لە کۆناغی لێکۆڵینەوە، بەڵام ئەمان تێکەڵاویان کردووە لەگەڵ ئازادکردنیشە، ئازادی کە حکمی ئیفراجکردنیشی لەسەر دەرەچێت. ئەبێت ئەڵێ ئەگەر محکەمەی تەمیز تەصدیقی نەکات ئێمە ئەگەر ئیفراجیش ببێ بەرەڵای ناکەین. محکەمەی تەمیزیش بەو غەڵەتا ڕۆشتووە ئەڵێ ئەبێ وا بێت کە لە کاتێکا وانە قانونەکە وا ناوە.
باش دوایەوە
زۆر کەس هەیە سیدکە بە ئیفراج بووە ئازاد بووە، بەڵام ساڵێکی زیاتر لە محکەمەی تەمیز قەرارەکەی ماوەتەوە تەصدیق نەبووە، ئەو هەر لە سجنا ماوەتەوە لە کاتێککە حکمی لەسەر دەرچووە بە ئیفراج بە ئازادکردن ساڵێکی زیاتر دوایەوە اینجا ئەمێنێتەوە یا 6 مانگ یا چەند مانگێک.
باش دوایەوە ئاخیرشتەوە چی بڵێ ئێستا بێڵێ بە ئەوەش تەرجمە بکەم.
ئەوەش بڵێ میتر ئێمە ئایا لەسەر ئەوەی کە ئایا محکەمەی قانونی تیرۆر هەبێ یا مەحاکمی نێودەوڵەتی هەبێ یا قانونی نێودەوڵەتی هەبێ، بەڕێی من ئەم قانونی تیرۆر هەموو جەریمەکان داناپۆشێت و ئەو قانونی محکمەی ینی ICC قانونەکەی شاملترە ئێستا باسی سەبایە ناکە ئەوانەی یەزیدیەکان لە قانونی تیرۆراتیان نییە چۆن محاکەمەیان بکات ینی ئەوە نقصانیە بەڵام لە قانونی نێودەوڵەتیە طبعا باشترە ئەبێتە جەریمەی نێودەوڵەتی بەڵام ئەم قانونە هەر بە تاوانێکی داخلی ئەتیبارەکرێت لە کاتێکە زۆر لە ئەو تاوانانەی کە ئاکرێ ئەتوانیت بە قانونی دژە مرۆڤایەتی یا بە قانونی ئیبادە ینی جێنەساید توانیت ناوی بنیت لە کاتێکە ئێمە لە قانونی ئێمە باسی ئەوە نەکردووە بۆیە من پێم وایە محکمەی نێودەوڵەتی چونکە بە تایبەتی ئەمانەش هەندێکیان جنسیەیان ئەوانەی کە گیرێن جنسی دەوڵەتانێکیان هەیە کە ئەو دەوڵەتانە ئەندامە لە محکمەی تاوانی نێودەوڵەت.
باشە زۆر سپاس کارزگار. And then finally I will say that another lack of rule of law is that the rule to be held in custody until you have your court meeting is being extended in our courts until the last appeal court has given their final decision. So you can be held in custody throughout several instances of the court. And also if you are not going to be imprisoned, they still hold you in custody until the last Supreme Court decides on their decision. So there are many more things I could say which makes us not fitting to really convict these ISIL members because the rule of law is not being held in best interest. But I can safely conclude that the ICC would definitely be the fitting court for the ISIL members to be held responsible in. And for that, we need the jurisdiction, the international jurisdiction to be applied. And as we know, the Iraqi government is not a member of ICC, which also is a political matter. Thank you for having me. بله کارگزار کتای من به نبو استا.
أنا باسي أود كذا ICC باشتر قانونكي براوانترا أول باس كذا.
Did you tell them that the ICC and Rome Statute is the most fitting tool for this?
چونك إساوي كومتم يزيد يكان وأنا أن بروشن جنا كان لقانوني إرهاب باسي نكب.
Because in the Terror Act there is no provision protecting the Yazidi women who were being held by the ISIL members. Although this is a clear genocide against the Yazidi people. So that's something we have to take into consideration. Basha kaguzgar yan doyak sakin o. Dejare khwafis.
Hataki la galtam yan mama.
Samtika لو لاق ساكن.
أما در كم اليوم؟
بله.
دني كم يعني؟
Okay, we are a bit behind schedule, but I think we take 5 minutes break before we then start the panel discussion.
Okay, should we begin? My name is Terje Einarsen. I'm the chairperson of ICJ Norway. I'm also a professor of international law at the University of Bergen. And I'm going to facilitate this debate. We have heard earlier today about the situation in Iraq and Kurdistan, and also briefly on the situation in Syria from Mats, where actually most of the ISIL people who are being detained or in camps, they are in the area controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces in Syria. So there are different kinds of problems. We heard about the rule of law and human rights, problems of fair trials in Iraq and Kurdistan. So although they are doing trials, it's important that we hear about the problems they're having, and maybe they will need some kind of support from the international community. But then, with regard to all those people in the Syrian area, it's also a question what can be done. And the title for this panel debate, at least in the amended program, is International Criminal Justice for ISIL Perpetrators Possible? But I think we'll start with the question of whether international criminal justice is desirable. What is international criminal justice in your opinion? And is it desirable to apply it to ISIL perpetrators? And I would like to start giving the floor to Elisabeth Baumann, a judge here in Oslo at the Borgarting Court of Appeals. She has also worked internationally, different places, and maybe you can explain also a little bit about your own work, Elisabeth. But you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I would start with saying that whether or not we should establish a tribunal court for the ISIL is actually a test for the international community. And I have done some research into another test that took place approximately 10 years ago. Is there a problem? No. Asking whether should there be any criminal justice mechanisms in Afghanistan. They were facing a very long period of past atrocities, and what I actually did was to explore whether the international community felt any responsibility to provide some criminal justice to this country who had suffered so much during, at that time, 20 years of warfare and terrible consequences for the civilian people. And actually my answer after 3 years of researching was that we did not pass that test. There were never any sort of actually effective mechanism taking place in Afghanistan. And I'm quite afraid that we are facing exactly the same problem now when we are asking these questions about how to make the ISIL perpetrators accountable. And this is a very difficult discussion, actually, because it's a matter of political will, obviously. There are a lot of tools. There are a lot of good tools. We have hybrid court, we have universal jurisdiction, we have the ICC, and we also had the testing out a lot of international hybrid courts before. So we have all this experience, and still we hesitate. And I shall not list all the good or the favorable things with the prosecutions. I think you all know that. But I have some questions I think it's maybe it could be fruitful to discuss, and that will show the terrible dilemma that we are in, actually. So my first question is there some lack of clarity as to whether prosecutions are only permitted or required? So is it only permitted? Is it something we should do, perhaps, maybe, in the next 100 years? Or is it actually required? And that means we have to do something then, that the international community has to understand that this is a huge obligation. And the other question is, such prosecutions by International Criminal Tribunal, is it compulsory? Do we actually have to do it? Or could we choose? And if you look into the international legal order, I think you will find that there's a lot of support in international law and international criminal law that this is compulsory. We cannot just look away and think that this duty, if we don't reply, will not haunt us, because it will, and these wounds will actually never heal if we don't do anything. And then my final question is, an international court, an international criminal court, is all very often described as a last resort solution. And I think we should remember that last resort, that is actually a very dynamic term. And if you look into the ICC, we know that they have a very narrow jurisdiction, and for good reasons, of course. It's only the most serious crimes, the most responsible perpetrators, and they have to pick and choose from which countries are not willing or able to do it for themselves. So we can explain the very tight jurisdiction for the ICC, but of course you can do that again if you establish a new criminal court facing the challenges regarding the ISIL crimes. And I think that this could also be narrow. We could concentrate on the most serious crimes. We could do, in many ways, what we have learned during the last years of development within the international criminal law. And I think if we don't do, it's a matter of losing trust into this very important global enterprise. So we have to find some solutions. And it's been very interesting to listen to the other participators. I believe that there are many tools available, and that we should discuss them more in practical terms, what is possible, but that we should do something is quite desirable. So my answer to desirable is yes. And what was your second question?
Okay, thank you. We've heard from you, Håvard, but maybe if you would like to add something to this issue.
What I didn't mention this morning before was the concept of the responsibility to protect, which is, promotes the idea that the international community has a responsibility, indeed a duty, to assist a state in fulfilling its own primary responsibility to protect the lives and well-being of those within its territory, not necessarily just its own citizens, but those within its territory. And now, the responsibility to protect is effectively to protect the rule of law within that state and the well-being of the people within that state. And assisting comes in with many faces. It could be assisting by supporting the national infrastructure of the courts with funding, where in some countries simply can't afford to do it, or it could be by actually setting up some sort of internal mechanism, as has been done in the Central African Republic, which was in a war-torn and completely disassembled state. And this was something that Kofi Annan was promoting with the group of senior people, the elders. So I think the idea is there, but as Elizabeth says, that the real problem is the political will to do so. And venally, the other problem is the money, because these are enormously expensive exercises. And with inward-looking states, I take the embarrassing situation of the United Kingdom in particular, where we have cut our overseas aid budget by £5 billion. In the meantime, we've wasted about £30 billion on inadequate masking and anti-COVID materials, and we spent £37 billion on a track and trace mechanism that barely works. But it's easy to persuade people to give up your international aid budget, because what's that? That's not helping British voters. I'm sorry to be so cynical, but it comes with age.
Yeah, so if that's the biggest problem, we should have had politicians here in the panel, probably. But let's turn to another feature, maybe. I'm not sure if you're prepared to answer this question, Mats, but what about the humanitarian situation in the camps and in those being detained in Syria in particular, maybe, but also the other places, if you know?
I just want to say that the politicians were invited to this meeting, but they didn't want to come, maybe for some reason. But no, I can just say that, I mean, in addition to being a member of ICJ in Norway, I'm also working part-time as a lawyer, and I was involved in one of the cases in Norway where a woman and her 2 children were repatriated to Norway in the beginning of 2020. I was in the past been working for the Red Cross for many years, and also now working for Save the Children. And Save the Children gave out a report earlier this year about the conditions, especially then in Ahul and Arush. And I can just say from this report, I mean, the humanitarian situation in these camps are just horrible. Horrible for the women, but especially horrible for the children. Lack of education, lack of medical care. And I mean, what we are doing today is not bringing any kind of justice to what has happened in these areas. So, I mean, from my side, of course, I mean, it would be ideal if it was possible to put up some kind of international court in the area. But I don't really see that happen. I don't really can understand how that can be done. So definitely, I think this falls back on the responsibility of the states. The question then is, which states are we talking about? I don't think the local authorities in the north of Syria is able to cope with it. So I definitely think that this goes back to also European states that needs to bring these people back and bring them to justice. When it comes to the children, I mean, if you were to have a court in the areas, I was also then interested to see, I mean, what will happen to the children? How will they be taken care of? And after they have got a sentence, what will happen to them? Will they stay and do the time in Syria, or should they be sent back? So, I mean, there are a lot of questions there. I don't really see any other solutions today than that this is up to the states, their home states, to bring them back and bring them to justice. This would be best for the victims, I think, of ISIL, but this is also definitely be taking responsibility for all the children that has done nothing wrong. So, yeah, that's part of my answer to the question.
Yes, but we need to move also to some other issues, since we are lawyers here. Maybe we also interested in the legal basis for prosecutions with regard to ISIL members. And then there is, it's interesting to note that in the national procedures, it's usually the terrorist provisions that are being used. Whereas at the international level, and the ICC cannot prosecute terrorist crimes unless they are also crimes under the statute. In some cases, terrorist crimes can also be war crimes and crimes against humanity. But apart from that, so maybe one question for you, Howard. Would it be imaginable to include terrorist crimes in the statute of the ICC? Or, I mean, how would that work?
Well, Nino Kusese, who was the first president of the Yugoslav Tribunal and then became president of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, so many courts. I was actually a judge of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon for 3 months because I went there, I got elected to be a judge there, and I went and all I did was help draft the rules of evidence and procedure, and then I changed horses to the ICTY because the British judge there left. But I mention that only to say that that got me to work with Nino Kusese, who was brilliant. And if you haven't read it and you want to start a book on international criminal law, Nino Kusese's International Criminal Law is the one to go through. I think it's in the second, maybe in the third edition now. I mention him because it was always his idea that once the Special Tribunal for Lebanon had finished its work, and it's now collapsed, as you may know, that should have been turned into a specialist terrorist court. It had the building, it had the staff, it had the judges. It's a very secure building. It used to be the headquarters of the Dutch intelligence services, so it's very secure. But that came to nothing, unhappily. I'm sure if Nino Kusese was still alive, he'd still be pushing for it. And I think that was the best hope. Bringing terrorism as a separate offence into the ICC suffers from the same problem as ecocide. It means amending the Rome Statute, and it means political will on a massive scale. To amend the Rome Statute, you need 75% of the members of the Assembly of State Parties to agree. That's a large ask. Well, I mean, when the ICC was set up, Trinidad and Tobago, who are the instigators, really, saw it as a transnational court. They thought it would deal with drug cases and illicit arms trading and things of that nature. But that was too broad a spectrum. And I think now there would be lots of political difficulty in setting up, in adding to the mandate of the ICC terrorist crimes. One of the problems is you've got to be able to define them. And as you rightly say, a lot of what are called terrorist crimes could be prosecuted just as easily as crimes against humanity, or in national jurisdictions as murder or attempted murder or causing explosions or things of that nature. The word terrorism is actually slightly pejorative, because as soon as you describe somebody as a terrorist before a court case even starts, you're putting a label on them, and it may be an accurate label, but it may not be. It may be unfair. It's like at the ICC, which deals with victims of crimes. It's very important to have a victims and reparation units, but the trouble is, if you nominate somebody as the victim of an accused before that person has actually been put on trial, you are, to some extent, predetermining the case. If you are assuming that person is a victim before there has a crime been settled that person was a victim of. So there are all sorts of difficulties with nomenclature and approach. Would I think that the idea of setting up now a international terrorist court, reviving the hopes and ambitions of Nino Kusese? Yes, I do. I mean, that would be a far easier exercise. It'd be an expensive one, but it'd be a far easier exercise than trying to amend the Rome Statute.
But do you think state governments would be interested in having international criminal procedures in terrorist cases? Or do they want to keep those cases?
Well, for one reason, actually, you talk about people wanting to keep the cases in their territories. Actually, a lot of countries don't. They want to export their terrorist cases, because the last thing they want to do is to be trying terrorist cases with all the security implications that means. Sometimes I think countries would like to rather wash their hands of the problem and say, yeah, do have our terrorists, please. You try them. We don't want to, or we can't, or we're frightened of doing so. Massive political will required, as Elizabeth says, and it would mean pulling it. First of all, recognizing that there's a problem. Secondly, defining what the problem is. Thirdly, putting the political will and the funding together to do it. I mean, as long as terrorists are prosecuted somewhere, I suppose people called terrorists are prosecuted somewhere. And it's easier in a national jurisdiction sometimes because you have a dedicated police force with dedicated anti-terrorist officers and investigators. That doesn't help the countries where the structure of the legal system doesn't allow for that, or whether it's simply a failed state where that structure is broken down completely, like one or two places in Africa, and one or two places in South America as well.
Just on this topic of terrorist legislation versus other, call it international crimes, I just wonder if I could just challenge you on one question there, and that is with regard to whether or not it's desirable to use some of this legislation on crimes committed in armed conflict. Because, I mean, of course, it varies from legislation to legislation, but my understanding is that some of this terrorist or actual terrorist legislation don't really capture, call it the gravity of what has been done in an armed conflict. Yeah. And I can just say, I mean, that was also be for the last panel to discuss, but here in Norway, of course, we have legislation on war crimes. We have it also on terrorist acts and also membership in terrorist organization. But I mean, if you have committed crimes in an armed conflict, for me, or the way I see it, I mean, it's much better to use the war crimes legislation because that more captured, call it, like I said, the gravity of the situation.
Wouldn't disagree with that. And it doesn't really matter whether it's an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict. The damage is the same.
Elizabeth, you wanted to...
Yeah. I think I just want to add to this discussion that actually we are facing a huge impunity for these terrible crimes. And if we don't address that impunity, it will haunt us later. And actually I do agree that putting up international court for against the terrorism is what we really can do, and I think we should decide for one option. I don't know exactly what is the political will at these days. Probably you describe this curve is going down, but eventually it will turn, and we should not lose the idea. I mean, if we sort of lose the idea of the international community's responsibility, I think that's the foundation for international criminal law. I mean, if we lose the idea of that, we lose a lot more. So, and I think regarding, if I would use the example of Afghanistan again, and 10 years ago when I was doing this research, nobody believed that the ICC actually would investigate the case of Afghanistan. But they are doing that now. We don't know how it will end, but it has a huge symbolic effect that it actually is going on. And that the ICC decided upon, I think you were in the appeal court at the time, that it was in the interest of justice to continue this investigation. So it's a symbolic effect. It has a lot of favorable side effects, fighting for some sort of justice mechanisms. So we must not lose that big perspective. We must also be practical, of course.
Yeah, I noted that we are sending one question to the next panel, perhaps, on the legal basis used to prosecute ISIL members, because they are prosecuted basically for membership in terrorist organizations, and then maybe losing a little bit the other aspects as much underscored, also with respect to possible genocide that have taken place against the Yazidi population. But maybe the next panel can, at least they are invited to also discuss that a little bit. Yes, so there are different possibilities internationally if the political will is present. One possibility would be to support the domestic processes in Iraq and in Kurdistan. Howard, do you have some ideas how this could be possibly done?
It is being done at the moment.
Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah, to some extent. I'm actually going to Baghdad in a couple of weeks' time to do some training of prosecutors and judges and to run mock courts, mock trials as a teaching aid. And that's being funded by the British Foreign Office. And there are other countries which are doing it as well. So money is going in. Probably not enough, well, certainly not enough. And it's a seed planting exercise rather than a revolution. You are hoping that you put some ideas and concepts and procedures in place which will grow. But it is being done. In some ways that is the easier way of doing it, and the government's, makes the government feel happy. It can, politicians can turn around and say, "Oh, we're doing something. We've spent £1 million or $1 million on it," and if that makes the government happy, that makes me happy because we can take their $1 million off and go and spend it on something worthwhile. To be absolutely honest, I think it's a sticking plaster solution. It helps to stop the wound spreading, but it's not the overall cure. The overall cure is to change the way people think about these offences. But remember, ISIL is not a domestic terror organisation, if that's the right word, terror organisation or right phrase. It's international. It wants to export, and it's said openly that the idea is to export its terrorism to Europe and to other places. So it's something that the international community has to take notice of as an international problem, and not simply look at it and try and contain it within Iraq or Kurdistan or Afghanistan or wherever. They've got to think about the bigger picture.
Rezgar M in his speech mentioned two different techniques, as he called it, for having people convicted, and one was the use of anonymous reports, and the second was the oldest techniques we know about, torture, right? To have people confess and then convicted. I was thinking a little bit when I heard that about something we visited in Guatemala, Elizabeth, when we were there. The institution the UN set up to reinforce prosecutions, but I guess also to secure objective evidence gathering. Maybe you will tell a little bit about that.
I can. The UN actually, they established investigating unit, the CICIG. I don't know the Spanish exact name, but it was composed by international by international participants. It was hybrid. There was also a lot of Guatemalan people working there. And they were looking into the most serious crimes like corruption, but also terrorist acts and other very serious crimes attacking the society.
Genocide.
And also genocide. And actually they had some basis within the peace agreement. And also they established this high-risk court, so that there were special judges selected for dealing with this, the results from these investigations. Unfortunately, now it's closed, the CICIG, but I think they had a great impact for a time on the rule of law regarding the very serious crimes. And we met a lot of these judges. We know that they were struggling, and they were the political terms were changing very rapidly, so it was actually a very dangerous job for a judge, being in that high-risk court. But it was a model, I think, can be reused if there is a political opportunity. And there's a lot of there's a lot of literature about the CICIG and whether or not it was a success. But I think it was a really interesting model, supporting the investigation and having this special court to deal with the offenders. You could probably add something, Terje. You were there too.
But maybe I know there are some people from the ministry. Maybe you can note that was regarded a success story in the Guatemalan context, and it was created by the UN, but of course it needed money, and maybe that could be something modest in a way of contributing, but constructively.
Well, I think it was it made some space for investigating a special sort of crimes that could have some political effects as well. For instance, state crime, where the state itself committed crime, that was part of what they were investigating. So it was also very, okay, there was some hot political questions, and in the end they had to close it down, and that was a matter of a political decision. But at one point I think it served the rule of law in Guatemala.
Well, time is running, so I think I give the floor to each of you for maybe if you have a brief final comment. That's all we can do. And then Rezgar, maybe he would like a comment, but we can also take maybe one or two brief questions before we close from the audience, if you have.
Well, a lot of interesting points have been raised so far. But I was wondering, when you were talking about the experience from Guatemala, how that would translate into a transnational situation. Because if I understand you correctly, that was that the institution in Guatemala was for Guatemala and problems inside Guatemala. Here we're talking about a situation spanning more than two countries. We could take in Turkey, we could take in the export of Islamic State to Northern Africa and Afghanistan, etc. So that would complicate it. That's one question. And the second question is the evidentiary situation regarding those who are now in the prison or detention camps in Syria. From what we heard from Iraq today, from Kurdistan, there were convictions on the basis of membership in the Islamic State. So that is according to Kurdistan and Iraqi law. That is also what has been applied here. That is a very broad definition. And we know that they have cases of children being arrested for membership because their father was a member and they polished the car of the father. So they were working for the Islamic State and they are convicted. 11, 12-year-old people. I mean, how would that translate into an international tribunal? And what are the expectations of convictions in Europe versus in Syria and Iraq? A lot of questions, unfortunately. Thank you.
I'm not going to answer, but maybe some in the panel will.
Well, in terms of age limits, I mean, the ICC sets it at 18. A person under 18 cannot be tried for any offences before the ICC, however culpable they may in fact be. You have to have a bar somewhere, and that's where the bar has been set. You have to be very cautious about membership of a prescribed organisation as to how wide-ranging that becomes. It really comes down to the maturity and professionalism of the prosecutors and, dare I say it, the judges, as to how you deal with those cases. Inevitably, when you're dealing with young people, you must take a different approach from when you're dealing with mature adults.
Could I just add that I would say that using children as soldiers in itself is a crime, and it's an international crime, and they will be prosecuted, those responsible for using these children. So that could be one answer. And also regarding the Guatemalan model, I could just mention that I think this sort of hybrid mechanism has been tried many places. I work myself in Afghanistan in a narcotic tribunal raised by the UN, served by the US, and it's still there actually. I don't know what happens now, but it did actually apply some very good standards of rule of law into the Afghan courts, the secular courts. So it's possible, it's being done all the time. But of course you have to have a dynamic view, you have to adjust it to the purpose. So.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's possible to just ask also one question to Rezgar that he might be able to answer. Because I was just also wondering if he has any knowledge or could say anything about the cooperation in Iraq with these investigation teams that was set up by the Security Council in 2017 to collect evidence. Because it could just be interesting to see if they have any, if he has any knowledge how that is working and how that is done on the ground.
شكو برودرويا مات برسياريكي هبولو دربارەی لێکۆڵینەوەکردن کە لە 2017 بڕیاریراوە لەسەری دروست بکرێ لە عێراقا زەدی ئیرهابیەکان هیچ زانیارێکە هەیە لەسەریان؟
لە 2017 خۆی فکرەیەکە بووەوە کەریم خان هاتە بەغداد چەند ماوەیەک لەوێ بوو وا بوو کە محکەمەیەکی بە شێوەیەکی جیاواز لەوەی کە هەیە دروست بکرێت بەڵام ئەوە سەری نەگرت لە پەرلەمانی کوردستان محاولەیەک هەبوو ئەم ساڵ کە محکەمەیەکی لەو بارەیەوە دروست بکرێت لە پەرلەمانی کوردستان بەڵام محکەمەی بەغدا ئیتیحادی اعتراضیان کرد لەسەری لە کاتێکە اعتراضەکەشیان قانونی نەبوو چونکە پەرلەمانی کوردستان ئێستا قەرارەکەی دەرنەکرد بوو ئەوان بڕیارێکی دژی ئەو محاولەیە ئەو مەشروعی قانونە بڕیارێکیان دەرکرد و پەرلەمانی کوردستانیش ڕایگرت ئیتر قانونەکەیان دەرنەکرد کە محکەمەیەکی تایبەت دروست بکرێ بە داعش ئێستا هەر محکەمە ئاساییەکانی عێراق و کوردستان خۆیانەی بینن.
I know that UNITAD in 2017 through Karim Khan attempted to establish a specialized tribunal for the ICC members and that they have done a substantial investigation, but that was not successful in Iraq. because Iraq did not accept it. And it was also tried in Kurdistan this year through the parliament, but the Iraqi government rejected it even before the parliament in Kurdistan decided upon it. So now it's only the national courts who try this kind of cases.
I
would just like to correct one note from what I mentioned earlier. فرموك رزقار.
ل 1990 کەیسی گەورەکان لە کوردستان لە ساڵ 2020 لەو ژمارەیە لە 1990 521 تیرۆر بووە بینیومانە.
باش.
تەرجەمەکەی تۆ بەنەوەی تر بوو.
بەڵێ. In 2020, there's been 1,190 accusations of terrorism. Among those 1,190, only 521 has been convicted as ISIS members.
يعني لو ژمارەیە 521 تەنها تیرۆر بووە. يعني نزیکە لە نیوە.
So that's approximately 1/3 of the cases. Vale, هیچی تر دەوێ بڵێ؟
أنا أو دو نقطة أو برسالة بقدر برسالة هر أو أبو.
باش كومنتي ترى هي استابيلي.
لسر بابتك والله كومنتي من اليوم بيوستا لهم حالك توانك هرشي بيت أبي مبادئ عدالة جنائي هم يجيب كتير باشي لدادجا كانا لليكولينو لدادجا كانا وأوي خلشي بيتاوان بحكم ندريت وتاوان باريش لدرو بمينيتو.
We have
تعويض بيوستا مراعاة ناكريت يعني قربو كتنوا أو قانوني كإيمتي دا هي قربو كيدانا ناوبو أواني كقربانين قربانيكا قرنترا للايمن لا أوي كسزاي تاوان بار بدريت كشتر أبي قربو بكتيرتو هزار حضرتي كردي يزيدي وماليان ويران كراوا وتوشي كشيكو ملايتي بون استا مناليان هي نازاني باوكيان كي امانه همو كشي لي كوتو بيستا هم كومالي نيو دولتي وهم حكومتي عراقي وهم حكومتي كردستان ابيت دراسه كي ورترو باشتر وام بابتا بكن وحلي مادي يعني يرمتي ماديا في بدريت او قربوي معنوي شان في بدريت وكا امانه خلصي كان لرويكم ملاتي وتشكاوت.
Finally, I want to say that the investigation and the conviction has to be improved. The way we have the terrorism acts today in Kurdistan and Iraq, it's not sufficient to have fair trials and make sure that those who are actually ISIL members are going to be convicted and that those who are innocent are going free. And also we need to address the victims here. It's not only about punishing those who are ISIL members. For example, the Yazidis, after this incident, they have no place to go back to. There are many Yazidi women who have children and they don't know who their fathers are or where to go back to. So the focus on redress is also to be stressed, both by the Iraqi and the international system. Zor spas.
Spas bo konferansa.
Thank you for the conference.
Thank you. And by these words, we close this panel now, and we'll have a brief break. Mats, I don't know when we're starting in 5 minutes. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
this seminar, in which we're pulling the threads from the international into the national and asking what is Norway's contribution to and also accountability for ISIL. So unfortunately, Nils Christian Nordhus, who was expected to be here, has become sick. So there's only, or not only, but there's two remaining. Fredrik Ranke, who is a senior public prosecutor at Statsadvokatembetet, and Bernt Heiberg, who's a lawyer at Elden Law Firm. So they will be first doing an introduction, and afterwards I will facilitate a discussion, first and foremost between Ranke and Heiberg, but I would also like to invite those of you here in the room to have questions, both to the panelists and kind of to the room at large. So if you then get to a point where you have any ideas or comments, that's when we will address those. But in the meantime, Fredrik Ranke, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I thought I had my notes here.
Did I take them?
Sorry. Know them by heart, but it's nice to have. Yes, thank you for this kind invitation. Do you hear me all right now in this mic? Yeah. Pleased to be here, and it was also very nice to be contacted by Pavan and Mats about this. Also great to see that my good colleague-in-law Bernt Heiberg is here to do the debate. It might be that we don't disagree on so many things. Bernt and I have met in courts several times, and it's always been conducted in a very friendly and professional manner. I'm, as you now know, a senior public prosecutor. I've been that for 7 years. Prior to that, I was a Norwegian diplomat for 9 years. But I'm here today as a representative of the Senior Public Prosecutors Service. And we enjoy complete independence from the government. That makes it a bit complicated today because the topics that are to be discussed find themselves at a crossroad between politics and law. So I will beg for your understanding that some of the questions you might ask or would like to ask are better answered by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Ministry of Justice. That being said, I'm a relative frank and open guy, so I'll try and be as frank and open as I possibly can. I have found it a bit hard to know exactly what I'm here to talk about. So I have decided that I will like to dwell on 5 different topics. The first one is if there should be an international tribunal for prosecuting crimes committed in Syria, or if it should be done through national prosecution. And my sort of answer is a bit like Winnie the Pooh. Both, please. Secondly, and quite pressingly, there's a question if the states are under an obligation by international law to bring their citizens or assist their citizens in coming home from Syria and Iraq. My answer to that is we're not, or the states are not obliged, but it's a possibility under international law to bring them home. The third issue is if those who have committed crimes in Syria should be prosecuted for international crimes or for terrorism. In my opinion, one doesn't exclude the other. During our trials against the foreign terrorist fighters, which is the UN word for fremmedkrigere, as we call them in Norwegian. There have been lawyers and others who have claimed that international and humanitarian law limits the scope of the Norwegian terrorism legislation. These claims have failed every single time. If time allows me, I would like to go through some of these failed claims. Now I'm going into the first topic, the topic about international tribunal or national prosecution. And as I said earlier, I don't think that one excludes the other. What is important is that the prosecution of the crimes committed in Syria is efficient, independent, and credible. Whether that prosecution takes place in an international tribunal or in national courts. I know that our government, both the Solberg government and the Stoltenberg government, and probably also the Støre government, have been positive and supportive for proposals of finding an international solution for the crimes committed in Syria. Thus far, China and Russia has blocked the Security Council referral of the situation in Syria to the ICC. And when we are talking about an international tribunal, we need to bear in mind how these sorts of tribunals normally works. They usually prosecute the big fishes in the pond. And I find it unlikely that the persons who have traveled to Syria from Norway and are still alive would be candidates to stand trial before an international tribunal, not least the women. In order to avoid impunity, however, national courts must try cases against those who assist, finance, or otherwise supports terrorist activities. And that's an obligation from UNSCR 1373, often called the 9/11 resolution that was being done in very short space of time, but it was founded on the work of the Clinton administration in the 90s at the UN for the Convention on the financing of terror. The obligation to prosecute was further strengthened by UNSCR 2178 from 2014, where the UN agreed that states are obliged to prosecute foreign terrorist fighters who return to their country of origin. And in 2020, last summer, the Supreme Court agreed with me that Norway has universal jurisdiction in terrorism-related cases. They overruled the Court of Appeal when concluding that we don't need a positive legal basis to exercise our jurisdiction in international law. As long as it doesn't breach international law, it's okay. The Supreme Court also supported us when we said that we can view the 9/11 resolution as an obligation to exercise universal jurisdiction in terrorism-related cases. I will return to this verdict in the final part of this opening statement. In my view, the Norwegian terrorism legislation constitutes a good foundation for Norway to fulfill her international obligations. And the international renowned terrorism expert, Mr. Magnus Ranstorp, or Dr. Magnus Ranstorp, has several times stated that among the Nordic states, and perhaps even in Europe, Norway has the best legal framework to combat terrorism. To conclude, like our government, I think international tribunals could be a good idea for Syria. if it materializes. But in the meantime, and also beside an international tribunal, I think that the national courts has a big role to play in prosecuting people who have committed crimes in Syria. The next question is if states are obliged to bring their citizens or assist them in bringing them home from Syria. And this is a very hot topic these days. We've all seen the conditions in the camps. I'm also well aware of the case against France in Strasbourg. And it's well known that Norway, along with several other European countries, has intervened on France's behalf in Strasbourg. In my view, international law doesn't oblige states to bring their citizens home. Traditional legal opinion is that European Convention of Human Rights, the rights according to that, doesn't, how should I put it, that it's limited to the area within the country's geographical jurisdiction. There are a couple of exceptions. If you occupy another country, or your diplomat does something bad abroad, or your NATO or UN forces does something illegal, you have jurisdiction, but the people who travel to Syria doesn't fall into any of those boxes. On the other hand, the states are not prohibited from assisting people in trying to get home, but that's a political assessment, and my office has been clear on this for many years. If those people are to be brought home, it should take place under consular procedures, not criminal procedures. And that's political, and it remains to be seen how this plays out, both in Oslo, Syria, and not least Strasbourg. I know there's been a debate here in Norway that we prosecute too few people for war crimes, that we choose the lowest hurdle and we go after them for terrorism-related charges. And as you know, the Norwegian Penal Code has different chapters for international crimes and for terrorism. And thus far, the prosecution has been prevented from using the chapter 16 in the Repa case, if you remember that, 12 years ago, and in the Rwanda case, because those crimes were committed before chapter 16 came into force. That being said, we are supportive of utilizing all tools in the toolbox, but as regards to Syria, we are yet to see a clear case where chapter 16 should be included in an indictment. We've been close on a couple of occasions, and if Bastian Vasquez had returned home alive, I wouldn't rule out that he could have been indicted inter alia for war crimes. I'm thinking of the video from 2014, just after the caliphate was proclaimed, where he harasses Iraqi soldiers in a building, border garrison, I think. And later in the video, you see the building explode. That looks like a war crime. But I also believe that this video shows how difficult it is to prove war crimes, because how can we know that those soldiers were in the building when it exploded? How can we know that it was the same building? We may assume it, but it's hard to prove it. But we are ready to take on such a case. Sweden are not as well equipped as us with terrorism legislation, and they've often chosen to prosecute on war crime charges. And I think they have been successful twice. At one time they found a cell phone where clear video footage of 2 Swedes who took part in an execution. We haven't enjoyed the same luck with phones thus far, but if we find one, we will, of course, use Chapter 16 if that's prudent. But I think you should be aware of what we've managed to prove in all these cases. Approximately 100 people left Norway and went to Syria. Many of those lost their lives on the battleground in Syria, working for, fighting for, or otherwise supporting the caliphate. The Norwegian legal framework for combating terrorism has been constantly expanded since 9/11. And in my view, Article 136, which ban or criminalize participation, support, or recruitment to ISIS, has served us well. It came into force in 2013. The first arrest of the foreign terrorist fighters were made in 2014, and the first criminal case took place in 2015 against the Avdili brothers and the third man. We've had 10 pure foreign terrorist fighters cases. If we include other terrorism charges against jihadis in Norway, the number is now 20. 19 have been convicted. I've prosecuted 14 of those 20. So at the National Senior Public Prosecutor's Office, I'm known as Abu Mushahir al-Norwegi, the father of the foreign terrorist fighters. It's one acquittal on financing of terrorism, but it's appealed, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to prove guilt of both those guys. In total, these cases has led to 108 years in imprisonment and counting. And in my view, it has weakened the extreme jihadi community in Norway. We have proved that these people who traveled has had a military role for ISIS. They took part in sharp military missions, kept watch. They lived in houses of displaced and ethnically cleansed people. There are pictures of Norwegian terrorist fighters with child soldiers. We have Norwegian foreign terrorist fighters talking about taking sex slaves, capture of women. We have ISIS participants who talk of entering a kindergarten in order to shoot the disbelievers, big and small. And we've heard foreign terrorist fighters, this guy is dead, talking of beheadings and shooting the brain out of the kuffar, the disbeliever. And we have that video with Bastian Vasquez. However, we have no concrete evidence of the actual enslavement, the actual ethnic cleansing, or the actual enslavement. But nonetheless, what we managed to prove is that these are very serious crimes. If time allows me, I would like to close this with some of these claims on international humanitarian law. The first one came in the first terror financing case in 2010. In the magistrate court, the judge ruled that the purpose of terrorism was limited only to include acts of terrorism in order to spread serious fear in the population. However, this was overruled in the Court of Appeal in the judge's legal summing to the jury. The defense lawyer also failed in claiming that the Geneva Convention Additional Protocol Article 1 gave Al-Shabaab the right to conduct conventional war crime, or conventional warfare. In the Avdili case, the first case against the foreign terrorist fighters, Valon Avdili and another man was convicted of participating for ISIS. Valon and his brother, Visar, were convicted of trying to support ISIS by sending equipment to a third brother, both brother in belief and actual brother, send equipment to him, but he died. and the defense lawyer failed in their claim that since Valon and the other guy had been doing relief work as well as being fighters, they should be exempt from punishment. Valon and Visar, they were released from jail a few years ago, and as you may have seen in the papers quite recently, they are suspected of having murdered a guy in Oslo. It looks like a real execution, and they are now living in Kosovo and are wanted. In the Isaac Ahmed case in 2015, Ahmed was convicted of conspiracy to terrorism and participation for both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. His lawyer used retired General Robert Moode's statement from 2012 describing those who went to Syria as freedom fighters fighting a just war, trying to topple a tyrant. The court rejected that notion that the ISIS fighters and Al-Qaeda fighters could be compared to the Norwegian volunteers in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s and the Norwegians who took part in Finland's winter war with Russia or Soviet Union in 1940. In the Magomedov case, Magomedov was convicted for conspiring and participating with ISIS. His travel companion Hassan Ahmed, Isaac's father, was convicted for participation in ISIS. He was acquitted by the jury for conspiracy. He had a rather peculiar stay in Syria. He joined ISIS with 20 grams of amphetamine, a bag of cigarettes, and heaps of Subutex, volunteered by accident as a suicide bomber. He didn't speak Arabic and raised his hand at the wrong moment, but he came back alive after 1 month and received 4 years imprisonment for his journey. Magomedov's lawyer tried to use Judge Heger, the judge in the magistrate court in the first case I mentioned, and this limited purpose of terrorism in that case, but to no avail. So the conclusion is that if ISIS conventionally attack government forces, even forces like Assad's, it's nonetheless an act of terrorism according to Norwegian law. It was also unsuccessfully claimed that ISIS lawfully could take part in conventional warfare because they had the ability to comply with the additional protocol Article 1. The court didn't agree because they clearly lacked the will to treat prisoners and the population in a civil manner according to the Geneva standards. The Supreme Court denied leave to this appeal and picked a prudent day on 4th of July. Al-Nashef case in 2017, it was unsuccessfully claimed that Al-Nashef had the right to be exempt from punishment because he was ethnically Syrian, returned to his homeland. And of course, if you are a refugee, you have the right to return to your homeland, but that doesn't give you the right to join up with a terrorist organization. In the so-called Uyghur case in 2019, a Uyghur living in Norway was convicted of participating and conspiring with both ISIS and an Al-Qaeda group from Turkestan in Syria. It was unsuccessfully claimed that it's insufficient that an organization is on the UN terror list. According to Norwegian law, if an organization is on that list, they are, per definition, a terrorist organization. You only need to assess an organization if they're not on the list. So that means that Al-Qaeda and the offsprings of Al-Qaeda, per definition, are terrorists. But when it comes to other organizations like the PKK, the FARC guerrilla, Hamas, organizations like that, you need to assess if they are terrorists or not, if their activities mainly are acts of terrorism. In the Al-Ayami case, which I started with earlier, the question was if we needed positive basis in international law to exercise universal jurisdiction. The Court of Appeal concluded that we needed a positive basis. In my view, the Court of Appeal, they had, in my view, limited support for this claim. Just selected work from academia, and we found support in the ICJ's Lotus verdict and the quite recent ICJ's ruling on Kosovo, Cassese, and others in academia, and last but not least, clear and unambiguous preparatory work of Norwegian lawmakers from 1888 to 2014. I know the ruling is criticized by parts of academia, but in my view it's rock solid. The ruling is cited at the US Congress Library's website, and it gives weight to the claim that terrorism, per now, is up there among with the other international core crimes. To conclude, my office, and I would like also to mention the legal department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, have been on the forefront in order to provide Norway with this legal framework that has, in my view, served us so well. In 2007, it was only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who supported my office proposal for a participation article. Not even the PST, the Security Service, supported this. But in 2013, it got through Parliament, and I believe that my office and the MFA will continue to be on the forefront as we develop legal tools to combat terrorism. And considering the broad cooperation, international cooperation in combating terror, naturally, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has a key role to play. Thank you.
Dear judges, dear colleagues, dear friends, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure always to discuss with my friend Fredrik. Unfortunately, Niels is not here today, so our planned two-way attack on his statement is unfortunately not able to be done as we planned. My name is Bernt Heiberg. I'm an attorney at law at Elden Advokatfirma AS. I've worked with Fredrik on at least 2 times. It's always a pleasure, as he said, to be with him in court. And it's always interesting and a pleasure to look at the international perspective of these kind of cases. I agree with Fredrik that the Norwegian legislation has proven to be quite versatile and quite efficient in bringing Norwegian citizens which participated in ISIL into criminal liability. In my view, and this is not the main thing we're discussing today, we might have gone too far. I think, in my opinion, the Magomedov decision that Fredrik referred to might have taken this a bit too long, but that is without consequences. The situation is that most of the Norwegian citizens that are returning from Syria are put on trial, are investigated quite efficiently, and are given, at least in a Norwegian consideration, quite long sentences for their participation. Our legal framework there differs quite radically from the other Scandinavian countries, which haven't been able to exercise this judicial responsibility for the participants. The main focus of my introductory remarks here, however, are going to be focused on the current situation in Norway. Because the situation for Norwegian citizens in Syria by now is that we have 4 identified women and 3 children living in the camps of Al-Rosh and Al-Hol in northern parts of Syria. I am representing one of these women, and they are stuck there. Based on the interpretation of Fredrik's office, these women's participation in ISIL by householding and fostering children and building kind of this home infrastructure of ISIL is considered participation in ISIL. This is a current case in Norway right now. If you can look at the participation statutes to include those things. But the situation is that all of these 4 women have been charged with participating in ISIL and are under investigation for participating in ISIL. In my view, an international tribunal will not be able to bring them into a criminal liability based on their alleged violations of Norwegian terror legislation. In Al-Rosh, it's living 2,400 people approximately. In Al-Hol, there's 70,000 people. Of these, 50,000 approximately are children and 20,000 are women. I think based on what we have heard earlier about the possibility to prosecute ISIL participants in northern Iraq, we hear that they are prosecuting and sentencing maybe 500 each year, or 500 since they have started based on this. I think in the International Special Tribunal on Yugoslavia, they managed to produce 161 indictments over a long period. The international task of bringing then over 20,000 women into criminal liability for their participation in ISIL is a task that is impossible. The only possible judicial infrastructure that can manage to do these prosecutions are the national ones, especially the Norwegian legal framework, which are quite well suited into these actions. The present political climate in Norway is that we cannot bring these women home. We don't have an obligation to bring them home, is the legal view, and we will not bring them home because they are there and they should stay there until we find a way on how to handle this. So the main question of this conference, in my view, what is stopping these participants to be criminal liable for their actions in ISIL? And in my view, that currently is the political or the lack of political will in Norway to bring them back. If they are brought back to Norway, they would be investigated, they would probably be prosecuted, and they might be sentenced to criminal sentences in Norwegian prisons. The other aspect of this is that when these women are staying in the camps in northern Syria, the police are unable to properly investigate both the actions that took place in ISIL and these women's specific actions there. They are not interviewed by the police. The police are not gathering the information what they can say about their experiences, what they know of other participants and other people in ISIL for all these times. We have one woman who returned based on the help from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. When she came back and was interviewed, the police got lots of information which helped them identify further cases and clarifying criminal liability on already pending cases. When we are not bringing them back, we don't get this information. As the other participants in this conference have earlier said, there is no possibility in Iraq or Syria at the present to conduct these investigations to find out more information about possible criminal acts in ISIL during this. Currently, in my view, there is only one way of efficiently keeping these women and these participants and the current remaining Norwegian citizen in Syria and Iraq criminal liable, and that is to bring them home. And for me, it's hard to understand why the National Authority for Prosecuting and Investigating investigation doesn't more clearly tell internally into the government that there is a need for criminal investigation to bring these people home. They should do so, to prosecute them, to investigate them, and to keep them criminal liable. And in my view, if the prosecution authority comes to the government with such a request, that would be obliged to. The other aspects that Fredrik introduced is if there is a legal obligation for us to bring these women and children back home. And I here disagree with him. I think we have seen a shift into international law concerning how sharp the boundaries are for jurisdiction concerning concerning extraterritorial actions and extraterritorial responsibility to react on the national governments. And this is kind of a doctrine that started with the responsibility to protect IDs and then have further increased to the specific boundaries for national jurisdiction. Professor Shawnee, the chair of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, is one of the leading theorists concerning this, and he is using a much more flexible approach regarding jurisdiction than what was earlier the idea concerning this. You have to look at both the individual state's relation to the individual we're talking jurisdictions about, where a specifically well-positioned relation with that individual and a dire humanitarian need might give that nation jurisdiction over that individual. And this is exactly the situation we're seeing in Syria right now, with horrible conditions in Al-Rosh and Al-Hol. We see this kind of doctrine is also getting more traction in the international area. The UN Child Committee, which is the main organ for understanding the Convention of the Rights of Children, have in two decisions, I think they are in 2019, said that at least the Convention of the Rights of Children cannot be understood that the jurisdiction of the states stops at the border. A nation, France, cannot accept that children, French children, are being treated in such horrible way in Syria, even though this is outside the territory of France. And as Fredrik said, in Strasbourg, we have these two upcoming cases, which we hopefully will get a decision for quite soon, in a couple of months, regarding both the extraterritorial responsibility for France for violation and breaches of Article 3 of inhuman or degrading treatment concerning the children and the women, and also the state's responsibility to grant access to the territory of that state. And in this aspect, it's really important to understand that the Kurdish self-governing authorities in Syria does not want these people here. They want them gone. America don't want them to be there. They recommend everyone to repatriate everything. So when you consider these two things together, both that there probably is a legal obligation to bring them home, and that lack of bringing them home stops us from putting them into criminal liability for their actions and giving them due process, is for me not understandable. And this situation will not disappear. It will continue until we bring them home all the way. And that is the current situation about the ISIL members, Norwegian ISIL members, still not being put to trial. And there, my time is up, so I will say thank you.
Fredrik, thank you, Bernd. I realized that I forgot to introduce myself when I started off. My name is Else Leona McClymans, and I'm the head of the Human Rights Committee of the Norwegian Bar Association, and I also work as a lawyer. But anyway, you have presented two kind of different perspectives here. One was a very thorough explanation of the current status quo in Norway, and also drawing on the actual cases we've had. And then you, Bernd, started off looking at our responsibilities in relation to those who are not here. And I think a starting point may be to look at the link to Norway in the prosecution and in the accountability of ISIS. Do we only prosecute those with a link to Norway?
Yes, yes. I think we so far only have prosecuted people with a link to Norway. This universal jurisdiction case I talked about, the Al-Ayami case, came about because he was an asylum seeker who managed to get to Norway in 2017, I think. Prior to that, he had stayed 4 or 5 years in Syria. He was originally from Lebanon, Palestinian. And we wouldn't have that case if he hadn't gone to Norway. So it's not like we're trying to play world police and bring terrorists to Norway in order to prosecute them. But if they come here, we will prosecute them.
Yes, and as you said, the information was based on his asylum interview, and that was also the case in the Uyghur case, wasn't it?
Yes, in the Uyghur case, I had that case, but I think yes, it was something in his asylum interview, and that he didn't renew his stay in Norway because he had gone to Syria, and then he came back after a long journey. Yeah.
Exactly. So you've basically prosecuted those who have been coming back.
Yeah, that's right.
And that is Bernd's coin.
I think the political climate right now is that we're not willing to bring back Norwegian citizens to prosecute them. And I think to bring back non-Norwegian citizens to prosecute them in Norway is politically impossible right now. And it probably shouldn't be done either. I wholeheartedly support the idea of international tribunals for the serious war crimes. I think that is the best way of building international law and building kind of a precedence that this is how we handle these situations. If people which can be suspected or prosecuted based on these crimes come to Norway without an international tribunal, of course we will do it here. But we will not go out and get them back to Norway. Then we should work on building these international tribunals.
If I may, Bernd said that our office should be more active in trying to bring these women home in order to prosecute them. But as an independent prosecution service, first of all, we have a lot of cases that the police security service work with anyway. So it would be not an overload, but it would be could be a lot of, I mean, you have to prioritize what you work with, and it would, I guess, be convenient for our politicians if the prosecution service was used in order to try and get people back from Syria, because then the politicians don't need to make the tough assessment if they should be brought home or not. And we saw what happened last time. It broke a government. So of course it's difficult for the politicians, but that's why we have politicians, in my view, and we don't have the prosecution service to do the politician's job. So I'm living quite well with my office taking the back seat on this, because okay, if they return, we will investigate them, we might indict them, but if they are in Syria, it's for the politicians to decide if they should be brought home. That's our view.
Yeah, I would like to say something about that, but because of course I understand Fredrik's points about this, right? It's easy, it's hard, it would be easy for the politicians to say that no, there is an investigative need to get them back. But at the same time, we see when we start investigating these cases clearly, when we interview the people who have been there, we get so much more information. We get all this inside information of what's been going on inside ISIL, who is there, information we can share with other governments, etc. And when we are letting letting these women stay in the camps without getting their statement, without investigating it, this information disappears. The other people they have information about vanishes, and the efficiency of the prosecution of all these cases from ISIL disappears. And there is no system in Syria or Iraq right now which can handle these investigations. And then the national states need to take responsibility and find out what happened there.
So actually then you're into what I think is a very interesting theme here, which is what kind of information would you need to include war crimes in an indiction? And that was your topic 3, Fredrik.
Yeah.
In the difference between what is participation in terror and what is a war crime. And what I hear you saying, Bernd, is that we need to persecute all these Norwegian citizens in ISIL. We need to take them home in order to broaden our scope and our knowledge about the situation there. Would that give you enough for a war crimes indiction?
I wouldn't exclude that the Police Security Service are well aware of the information that these women have given in testimonies earlier. I mean, it's well known that it's been stealth investigations against lots of foreign terrorist fighters before they went and during their stay there. So if we get more information by bringing them home, I'm not too sure about that. And often the information that you receive are about people who are dead or information that the police already know. But to broaden our scope with international war crimes. In the terrorism chapter, you are convicted of your conduct, and we have phone tappings, we have Facebook postings, we have live chat, where you can see what sort of activity they've been into, and where they explain to friends why they are doing what they are doing. So they aren't convicted for their thoughts, but for their actions and participation. But with war crimes, it's something different, because then you need to have actual proof of the exact execution. You have to know where it happened, when it happened, who was involved, and you would probably also need to interview witnesses. And with the situation in Syria and the regime in Syria, that's almost impossible, unless you have clear video footage beyond reasonable doubt shows that, say, a Norwegian or man or woman who traveled from Norway have taken part, or that they actually explain it in an interview with the police. But we haven't been there yet.
So it's actually lack of evidence. Is
Yeah.
that what you're saying?
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would you say to that, Bernd?
Yeah, I agree. To have the proof for, or since the requirements to judge someone for participating in ISIL is much easier to handle given the current information situation. And since, as Fredrik also said, that armed resistance against the Assad regime is considered a terrorist act in Norwegian law, then also conspiracy to conduct terrorist acts will be like an agreement to make military service for ISIL, right? Which is also quite easier to handle than to identify current war crime situations and pointing at the responsible people. But I also think that it's not necessarily so that the Norwegian who participated in ISIL necessarily conducted these acts, right? It's hard to know if this is lack of evidence or that the people or the Norwegian citizens didn't commit these acts. And this is the situation we are in, basically.
Yeah. And then you said something interesting, Fredrik. You said some of the international courts only target the big fish in the pond,
Yeah.
whereas we target everybody.
I wouldn't say we target everybody. Bernd would probably say that.
I agree with that.
And Lars. I mean, when you think about all the atrocities in the former Yugoslavia, and when you learn that they've had 140 cases, it tells you that you need to be a high-ranking member of ISIS or Al-Qaeda in order to be prosecuted in an international court. So if you've been keeping guard or being on sharp missions, being sort of a private in the army, then you wouldn't get the nod from the ICC, I think.
And at least not if you're a woman and your participation is householding and giving birth to children. That would, of course, not be possible to prosecute in an international tribunal.
But that's also the difference maybe between participation and collaboration, because the Penal Code 136A states, and I'm going to read it just so that you can hear it, it says that it should be applied to any person who forms, participates in, recruits members into, or provides financial or other material support for a terrorist organization when the organization has taken steps to achieve the purpose by unlawful means. So it's a very wide description, but how active do you have to be a member?
If you the most important ruling on that is the Ubaydullah Hussein case and the Avdili case. And in the Hussein case, he was convicted of participating for ISIS from Norway by facilitating and recruiting and financially supporting foreign terrorist fighters. Most of those he helped to Syria died or are convicted as participants. You need to have an active role. So you need some sort of activity, but the ruling in the first case, in the Avdili case, is that if you declare bay'ah, that you pledge allegiance to ISIS, even though you can't say that you don't have to formally make a formal agreement to participate with the organization. If you have pledged alignment to the organization, you don't need that much activity in order to be viewed as a participant.
So the allegiance is enough?
Yeah.
The membership itself?
Yeah, the membership, but the membership isn't enough. You have to do something. So, and on the other hand, if you don't pledge allegiance, that doesn't exclude you from participation, because the court agreed with us that you don't need to have formalities in order to be viewed as a participant. But clearly, you need some activity. So if the courts here has said that if you travel to Syria, you join a Sharia school, you take part in military training, then you clearly are above the threshold of, then you clearly are a participant. Like this Hassan, the guy with the strange suitcase he brought with him to Syria. Nore's client.
Suicide bomber.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He stayed for 1 month and he traveled around and joined up with Sharia and the Sharia school. And I don't think he tried to make it to a training camp, but the trainers weren't there, and he didn't have that much activity, but the court was quite certain that that was enough, and his appeal was rejected by the Supreme Court.
So from his perspective, it was a failed trip and a failure to come back.
Yeah, but I think he should be glad that he got back.
Yeah, well, maybe. But in terms... Oh.
Yeah, I would like... that case. I think we have two of the presiding judges here today over that case. Both Baumann and Wiig, I think, was presiding in that case. And that case is quite interesting because it both says something about the activity that's needed to be done to participate, but it also says something about where the threshold for conspiracy to conduct a terrorist act is. Because I think Magomedov was judged for that, but Nore's clients was acquitted of that. And that was based on how far they came in their military training. And documentation about what they did in their military training regarding this, which is, like Fredrik said earlier on, it's a little bit random what kind of pictures you find and what kind of pictures they have posted online that you can use as evidence later on. But the threshold is really low in Norway, and that's why we, compared to other Scandinavian countries, have been quite successful in prosecuting the people who have returned.
If we think about under the war crimes, you need a collaborative perspective. You need, there's a collaboration and medvirkeransvar. Where would that lead us? The differences between chapter 16 and chapter 18?
Depends, of course, but quite recently we had, and we are awaiting the ruling, a colleague of mine had a case against a man from Skien who tried to, or is judged or ruled to have helped people in preparatory acts for terrorism, altså forsøk på terrorhandling. And I think he received 14 years for that. And in the Al-Ayami case, the Supreme Court agreed with us that for conspiracy and participation, he would, before you take into account that he helped the police, he was looking at 13 to 14 years imprisonment. So I'm not sure if, I mean, if you have a war crime with someone who has taken part in mass execution or mass rape or really serious war crimes, you could be looking at 30 years, so you could be looking at forvaring and things like that. But I'm not sure that they would be sentenced to that much more imprisonment, but it depends on the role, of course.
So actually what you're focusing on is then that the net for just imprisonment is low, we're catching them, but we're not necessarily addressing some of the atrocities that they've committed.
I wouldn't say it's too low, because they actually traveled to Syria and joined up with the terrorist organization, joined the Sharia school. We have a clear picture of them wanting to take a military role for a terrorist organization. So of course, if that's low, I don't think it's low. But for participation, you don't need to prove their intent. That means that Magomedov, if you were right on the Magomedov case, he would have been, he might have been acquitted for conspiracy, but he would still be a participant.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
And so you get them under chapter 18. Are there any questions? I've been focusing my, looking at you two gentlemen. Are there any questions here? Okay, Mats, could you please come up and ask your comment or question in the microphone?
Well, I have two comments and one question for Fredrik. Just with regards to the question about repatriation, is it a legal duty on states to do that? I mean, I definitely agree with what Heiberg was saying, but I also want to mention international humanitarian law, because we should remember that these people now in Syria, in Iraq, are being detained as a result of an armed conflict, and the Geneva Convention, as I read them, doesn't have really the same rules of jurisdictions as the human rights conventions. And I mean, also under IHL, there are rules about repatriations of prisoners of war. Of course, these are not prisoners of war, but also according to, I mean, the customary law of international humanitarian law, there could also be rules there with regards to repatriating people that are being detained in an armed conflict. So I think this is also something definitely states should take into consideration before concluding, as Norway did, that they don't have an obligation. The other remarks is about war crimes versus provisions on terrorist acts, because I am one of the persons that is quite critical of what Norway is doing and applying these rules on terrorist acts in an armed conflict, because the problem, as I see it, is that the rules on terrorist acts, it doesn't really distinguish between, or it goes more after which side of the conflict that you are participating, rather than looking at actually which acts you have committed during the conflict. And for me, I mean, that goes really against the spirit of IHL, so that's also why I'm quite critical of what they're doing. I do understand what Fredrik is saying about, I mean, lack of evidence, the problem of providing evidence for war crimes. So my question to you, Fredrik, is there any cooperation between your office And UNITA that we heard about earlier today, is there any cooperation with other countries that have been able to convict these people for war crimes?
Yes, we are taking active part in Eurojust in The Hague, the genocide network. I've been there, I'm not covering it anymore for our office, but I've been there 4 times, and my colleague was there last week. So of course we cooperate with other countries, and we try to see how they have managed to get these cases. And of course, if people from the Syrian army or the Syrian regime comes to Norway, or are part of the refugee wave that we saw coming to Norway in 2015, and we find proof against them, I would be very happy to prosecute such a case. I think that, of course, you can say that I understand your criticism that it's sort of one-sided, because the perpetrators in Syria are sitting safe and sound in Damascus. On the other hand, I don't think that should exclude us from prosecuting cases against the foreign terrorist fighters. I mean, if you look back to 1945, should you not prosecute the Germans in Nuremberg because you couldn't prosecute Stalin for Katyn when they had a war on aggression against Poland, because it would be one-sided that only the Germans were prosecuted and not Soviet Union for their war crimes before they were attacked by Nazi Germany. So I think that, okay, it's an imperfect world. We just have to deal with it. And if we manage to prosecute cases against Syrians for the regime, that would be a good signal. But until then, I think we should do as we do and prosecute when it's prudent against ISIS.
You're saying an imperfect world, but if in a perfect world, what do we need to do? I'll give the question to Bernd first, so he can answer while you think, and then...
I think I agree that we can't stop prosecuting atrocities because we can't prosecute the other side. And this is mainly the main argument for establishing ICC and establishing the international tribunals, because then you are creating a legal framework that can be applied more efficiently without the boundaries that Norwegian national prosecution now sets up there. So I think, I believe also that, like Justice Morrison said, that we are in this kind of developing thing where you're going nationalism and then you're going multinationalism. And I think we need to exploit the peaks and build up these institutions when we have the political possibility to do so in international law, and try to keep them and use them as much as possible when we are at the bottoms. And over the long run, if we establish international tribunals efficiently regarding this, then I think we are heading towards a better state.
Yeah, and Judge Morrison this morning also said that, or not this morning, but earlier, he said that one way of doing it could be to have the ICC, but then with national throngs, is the way I understood you, or national tiers. Would that be a possibility?
I think so. I think there is. I think the lack of evidence and the lack of possibility to investigate potential cases hampers ICC the same way as it will hamper Fredrik's office for investigating what happened in Syria. And that is kind of what we need to build up. We need to build up an efficient organization that can both investigate the facts and then apply the law later on. And I think that way might be possible. But I think the important thing is that we continue to stress the use of international tribunals when it is possible.
And now, Fredrik, over to your perfect world.
I think that's one of the questions that are better answered by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But I think I can subscribe to much of what's being said by my good friend Bernd here. I think international cooperation in order to prosecute people for war crimes are essential, and building institutions and so forth. So good thoughts, I think. Yeah.
I did not see any more hands. If there is a hand, please.
Isn't it a paradox that if we're talking about a tribunal or even a national prosecution of the leaders of the Islamic State, one would have to establish solid evidence, like the Yugoslav tribunal, with meticulously going through interviews, records, you gave the order for this action, and so on. While a woman coming back from Syria, where she went because she was in love with a guy and she had his child, and then that is qualified participation in a terrorist organization, and she can be prosecuted in Norway and sentenced to a long prison sentence. To me, this is strange. And as Ranke mentioned, what happened after the war at Nuremberg, SS was criminalized. It had 800,000 to 1.1 million members. How many SS were prosecuted for just their membership? As far as I know, none. They were all convicted for their actual participation in the massacres they participated in, not least in the camps. So to me, it is very strange, and it is something to be reminded that our neighboring countries do not have this broad concept of participation or conspiracy. And conspiracy in a situation of a civil war, I mean, are you conspiring? I should actually tell, for those who don't know, I have been following almost all these cases, including as an expert witness, and none have been convicted for specific acts. Conspiracy is a preemptive criminalization. And then you can say whatever you want, Fredrik, but then you are criminalizing thought. And it is your thoughts about what they have planned to do. And that is dangerous. Should we do something about the Islamic State? Definitely. It should be held accountable. But if we lower the evidentiary criteria, then we are not operating within the rule of law. I will not draw the comparison to Iraq, but it is a dangerous path to tread along. So, okay, that's my comment.
That was a comment, and Bernd has a response.
Yeah, I would say something, and this is part of the last panel sent over to us, this request if we, by jumping over where the fence is the lowest and we don't prosecute these criminal war crime things, war crime atrocities. And I really disagree. I think that the Supreme Court should have handled the Magomedov case regarding if normal military actions against the Assad regime were considered terrorist acts or not, or if those were legal based on the civil war situation. Because there is a real risk if we are saying that not participating in the atrocities that ISIL was doing, but just participating in the organization becomes the main thing, then we loses the focus on the real atrocities, the real massacres, the Yazidi slaughters, the burning of pilots and prisoners of war, etc. And all of these things disappears because we get 8 years in prison just for participating in the military actions. And this is kind of the paradox in this situation, because of course participation is also things we should criminalize, but we shouldn't lose track of the real atrocities. And that is maybe what I think we should have done a little bit different.
Yes, I understand what you're saying there, but closing remark from me on this is that when people who have joined an organization that has Norway in its hold Norway as its enemy, and they return to Norway, it's a security aspect as well. And the terrorist legalization is primarily there to protect Norwegians. And then we need to use those tools in order to keep these people off the street for their actions or participation for that sort of organization in Syria.
So basically what both of you are saying is it's necessary to have two thoughts in the head at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think with these words, it's up to you, Mats, to give us a final way home.
Well, I can see that we are a bit behind schedule, so I won't take up much of your time, but I mean, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you especially to our guests for the debate, and especially to our international guests, both Morrison and Rezgar, who I know is still with us from Iraq. So thank you, and I'm sure that we will come back on this discussion many, many times in the future. So thank you.